As Islam's presence waned in Spain, the Pope faced little resistance in asserting his authority over the Church in the reconquered territories. The donation of Constantine, though falsely accepted as authentic by much of Western Christendom, granted him temporal sovereignty over numerous lands, and the inclusion of the Iberian Peninsula went largely unquestioned. In Spain, there existed no ecclesiastical institution strong enough to oppose him. The situation in Eastern Christendom, however, was quite different. The patriarchates of Alexandria and Antioch were as ancient as the See of Rome itself. The Patriarchate of Jerusalem, home to the Church of St. James, though younger, held a unique prestige as the guardian of the world's holiest city. Yet, it was Constantinople that posed the greatest challenge. While it could not claim the same antiquity despite its alleged foundation by St. Andrew, it had become the new Rome, having supplanted the old imperial capital. It was home to the unbroken succession of Christian emperors and stood as the grandest city in Christendom. Its patriarch could rightfully style himself as ecumenical patriarch, the foremost religious leader of the civilized world. Within Byzantium, religious factions occasionally sought to invoke the authority of Old Rome to counterbalance the growing dominance of the emperor. However, few in the East ever seriously entertained the idea that the bishop of the diminished Western city should wield any jurisdiction over the ancient and deeply rooted Eastern churches. Nonetheless, Rome continued to command a certain reverence. Though its claims of supremacy were dismissed, its primacy among the great sees of Christendom was widely acknowledged, even by the ecumenical patriarch. No one questioned the ideal that Christendom was, and ought to remain, united. Following the Arab conquests, the patriarchates in the southeastern regions saw their influence greatly diminished, leaving Constantinople to assume the role of protector of the Eastern churches. Numerous disputes and disagreements arose between Rome and Constantinople over church matters, though none were as grave or prolonged as later accounts would suggest. The general unity of Christendom persisted. However, in the 11th century, the Roman Church underwent significant reorganization. Much of the Reform movement was inspired by monastic ideals from Cluny and Lorraine and was initially driven by secular authorities who then controlled Rome. Emperor Henry III played a particularly active role, and his initiatives gained such momentum that even after his death, the Church was able to advance and eventually pursue these reforms independently, ultimately positioning itself in opposition to lay rulers. From this movement emerged doctrines asserting Rome's universal spiritual authority and its supremacy over secular powers. These assertions, in turn, ignited renewed conflicts with the Eastern Church. At the heart of the conflict was Rome's renewed assertion of its supremacy. Yet, the initial dispute focused on specific doctrines and practices. In its efforts to consolidate authority, the papacy aimed to unify church practices across Christendom. Beyond its desire to end the marriage of secular clergy, it also sought to standardize liturgy and ritual. While such reforms were achievable in the West, the Eastern churches followed different traditions. Greek churches existed within Roman influence, just as Latin churches were present in Constantinople's sphere. In southern Italy especially, the boundary between these two spheres had long been a matter of contention. Meanwhile, under German influence, the word filioque had been added in Rome to the creed statement regarding the procession of the Holy Spirit. The reforming popes, more uncompromising than their predecessors, refused to remain silent or flexible on such issues. Confrontations became unavoidable. When Pope Sergius IV issued his systematic letter, he included the Filio clause. In response, Patriarch Sergius II of Constantinople declined to commemorate the Pope's name in the diptychs of the patriarchal churches, signaling to the Byzantines that the Pope, personally, was deemed unorthodox on this doctrinal point. However, this action was not interpreted as a condemnation of the entire Western Church's orthodoxy. Conversely, in the West, where the Pope was seen as the ultimate guardian of doctrinal truth, this omission was viewed as a grave and far-reaching insult. The Patriarch soon realized that the prospect of restoring the Pope's name to the diptychs could serve as a valuable bargaining tool. In 1024, Constantinople proposed a potential resolution to Pope John XIX. The suggestion was carefully crafted to grant Rome titular supremacy while preserving Constantinople's practical autonomy. It stated that, with the consent of the Roman pontiff, the Church of Constantinople shall be considered universal within its sphere, just as Rome is within the universe. John XIX was inclined to accept the arrangement. However, the Cluniac abbot of St. Benignus at Dijon intervened with a forceful letter, reminding him that the authority to bind and loose in heaven and on earth was entrusted solely to St. Peter and his successors. The abbot urged the Pope to govern the universal church with greater resolve. Byzantium would soon learn that the Reformed papacy was unwilling to accept such compromises. By the middle of the century, the Norman incursions into southern Italy made a political alliance between the Pope and the Eastern Emperor desirable. However, the Reformed papacy was now firmly committed to its policy of standardization, seeking to eliminate Greek practices prevalent in the churches of southern Italy, which had also been adopted by numerous Italian churches as far north as Milan. In 1043, Michael Cerularius, a proud and ambitious man, became Patriarch of Constantinople. He was equally determined to enforce uniformity within his own jurisdiction. Initially, his motivation was to integrate the newly acquired Armenian provinces, where distinct customs, such as the use of unleavened bread, were observed. However, his efforts also extended to the Latin churches in Byzantine-controlled Italy and to those in Constantinople, which served merchants, pilgrims, and members of the Varangian Guard. When these Latin churches refused to comply with his regulations, Cerularius ordered their closure and began circulating pamphlets denouncing Latin practices. Cerularius, however, appeared less concerned with theological matters. He was willing to restore the Pope's name to the diptychs in exchange for reciprocal recognition at Rome. The conflict primarily centered on ritual practices, bringing to the forefront the issue of ecclesiastical boundaries in Italy. Negotiations were initiated by Arjurus, the Lombard governor of Byzantine Italy, a Byzantine subject who practiced the Latin rite. While the emperor trusted Arjurus, Cerularius remained wary, and events soon favored his position. In 1053, before any papal envoys could be dispatched to Constantinople, Pope Leo IX was captured by the Normans. When the papal legates, led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida, finally arrived in Constantinople in January 1054, they were received honorably by the emperor. Nevertheless, Cerularius questioned both their official appointment and the Pope's ability, while in captivity, to authorize any commitments they might make. In April, before meaningful discussions could progress, Pope Leo IX died. The legates, having lost their official mandate, found themselves in an uncertain position, as the next pope would not be elected for another year, leaving his policies unknown. Cerularius refused to continue the negotiations. Despite the emperor's wish for reconciliation, tensions escalated. Eventually, the legates departed in anger, leaving a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia, condemning the patriarch and his close advisors, but explicitly acknowledging the orthodoxy of the Byzantine Church as a whole. In response, Cerularius convened a synod that rejected the bull as the work of 3 unauthorized individuals. The synod condemned the addition of filioque to the creed and the persecution of married clergy, but it made no general condemnation of the Roman Church or other disputed practices. In reality, nothing changed. The patriarchates of Alexandria and Jerusalem remained uninvolved. Peter III, the Patriarch of Antioch, considered Cerularius unnecessarily obstinate. His church continued to include the Pope's name in its diptychs and saw no reason to stop. He likely feared that Cerularius, whose ambitions he distrusted, harbored intentions against the independence of Antioch. Peter sympathized more with the emperor's position and opposed the drive for uniform liturgical practices, as his diocese encompassed churches using the Syrian liturgy, many of which lay beyond the empire's political borders. Even if he had desired uniformity, he could not have imposed it. Thus, he remained apart from the conflict. Over the following decade, relations saw a slight improvement. Michael Cerularius was deposed in 1059, and not long after his removal, the Latin churches in Constantinople were reopened. In southern Italy, the Normans, who had become loyal allies of the papacy since 1059, were increasingly successful, making it unfeasible for Byzantium to maintain its ecclesiastical claims in the region. In 1061, Roger the Norman launched the conquest of Sicily from the Arabs, a holy war encouraged by the Pope. Here, too, Byzantium faced the loss of control over its Christian communities. By 1073, Emperor Michael VII recognized the necessity of fostering a good relationship with Rome. Following the Norman capture of Bari in 1071, he feared further Norman aggression, which papal influence might help to prevent. At the same time, the Turkoman invasion of Asia Minor had begun, leaving Michael desperate for soldiers. Recruiting troops from the west would be more feasible if relations with the papacy were warm. In 1073, Cardinal Hildebrand, already renowned for his vigor and integrity, was elected pope under the name Gregory VII. Firmly convinced of the supremacy of his office, Gregory chose not to send a systematic letter to any of the Eastern patriarchs. Nonetheless, Michael made a diplomatic overture, sending the new pope a letter of congratulations, subtly expressing his desire for closer ties. Pleased by the gesture, Gregory dispatched Dominicus, the Patriarch of Grado, as his legate to Constantinople to assess the situation. After receiving Dominicus's reports, Gregory became convinced of Michael's sincerity. He also learned of the deteriorating situation in Asia Minor. While pilgrimage to Palestine was still possible, the route across Anatolia would soon be perilous if the Turkoman advance was not halted. Inspired by this crisis, Gregory devised an ambitious new plan. The Holy War, already being fought successfully in Spain, should be expanded into Asia. His allies in Byzantium needed military assistance, and he would provide it by sending an army of Christian knights under church authority. This time, due to the accompanying ecclesiastical issues, the Pope himself would lead the expedition. Gregory envisioned his forces driving the infidels out of Asia Minor. Afterwards, he would convene a council in Constantinople, where the grateful Eastern Christians would resolve their disputes and recognize Rome's supremacy. Whether Emperor Michael was aware of Gregory's full intentions, or whether he would have welcomed them, remains uncertain. In the end, Gregory was never able to realize his plan. His rigid adherence to his policies drew him into escalating conflicts in the West, forcing him to abandon his Eastern ambitions. Yet, he never forgot them, nor did he lose interest in the East. In 1078, Michael VII was deposed. Upon hearing the news, Gregory immediately excommunicated the usurper, Nicephorus Batiniates. Shortly thereafter, an impostor appeared in Italy, claiming to be the deposed emperor. For a time, the Normans pretended to recognize him, and Gregory offered him his support. When Nicephorus was eventually replaced in April 1081 by Alexius Comnenus, the excommunication was extended to the new emperor as well. In June, Alexius wrote to the Pope in an attempt to regain his favor and to seek assistance against the aggression of Robert Guiscard. However, no reply came from Rome. Instead, Alexius turned to Henry IV of Germany, who proved a more promising ally. Meanwhile, Alexius ordered the closure of the Latin churches in Constantinople. To the Byzantines, it appeared evident that the Pope had allied himself with the treacherous and impious Normans. They exchanged wild tales about his arrogance and lack of compassion, and when Gregory died, they saw his death as divine retribution. By 1085, the year of Gregory's death, relations between the Eastern and Western churches had reached an unprecedented low. The Eastern emperor had been excommunicated, and the Pope was actively encouraging opportunistic adventurers to attack fellow Christians, while his primary adversary, the German king, was openly receiving financial support from Byzantium. Hostility and resentment continued to grow on both sides. Yet, no formal schism had occurred. The unity of Christendom could still, in theory, be preserved through wise diplomacy. The East had an Emperor Alexius, a leader with the flexibility and foresight of a true statesman. A man of similar caliber was about to emerge in the West. Odo de Logari was born around 1042 into a noble family from Châtillon-sur-Marne. For his education, he was sent to the cathedral school at Reims, where his teacher was Saint Bruno, who would later found the Carthusian order. Remaining in Reims, Odo rose to the positions of canon and then archdeacon, but he found these roles unsatisfying. Abruptly, he chose to retire to the monastic community at Cluny. In 1070, he was accepted into the monastery by Abbot Hugh, who quickly recognized his talents. After serving for some time as prior, Odo was sent to Rome, where he rapidly distinguished himself. In 1078, Gregory VII appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. From 1082 to 1085, he served as legate in France and Germany, returning afterward to remain by Gregory's side during the Pope's troubled final years. Upon Gregory's death in exile, with the anti-Pope Guibert controlling Rome, the loyal cardinals reluctantly elected the hesitant abbot of Monte Cassino, who took the name Victor III. The Cardinal of Ostia disapproved of the election and made his dissatisfaction known. Yet Victor bore him no resentment, and on his deathbed in September 1087, he recommended him to the cardinals as his successor. Gregory VII, too, had expressed his wish for Odo's succession. Nevertheless, it was not until March 1088 that a conclave convened in Terracina and elected him as Pope Urban II. Urban was well suited for his role. He was an imposing figure. While he lacked the passion and single-minded determination of Gregory VII, he surpassed him in vision and skill in dealing with others. He was neither as proud nor as stubborn as Gregory, though he was by no means weak. His loyalty to the Pope and his principles had even led to his imprisonment in Germany at the hands of Henry IV. Urban could be stern and unyielding when necessary, but he preferred gentleness and sought to avoid conflicts that might breed bitterness and discord. He inherited a challenging situation. His safety was assured only in Norman-controlled territories, and even there, the Normans were often selfish and unreliable allies. Rome itself remained under the control of the anti-Pope Guibert. Urban could venture into the outskirts of the city, but entering further would have provoked bloodshed. Further north, Matilda of Tuscany remained his steadfast supporter across her vast holdings. In 1089, she further strengthened her position through a calculated marriage to Welf of Bavaria, a German prince less than half her age. However, in 1091, Matilda's forces suffered a crushing defeat by Henry of Germany at the Battle of Trisanti. At this point, Henry stood at the peak of his power. Crowned emperor by the anti-pope in 1084, he ruled Germany and dominated northern Italy. A pope as precariously positioned as Urban had little hope of commanding obedience beyond his immediate sphere. Nevertheless, Urban continued his patient and diplomatic efforts, and by 1093, the situation had dramatically shifted. Through the strategic use of financial resources rather than military force, he was able to celebrate Christmas that year in Rome and soon afterward took up residence in the Lateran Palace. Henry's strength began to wane due to the rebellion of his own son, Conrad. In France, his homeland, Urban successfully brought the entire ecclesiastical hierarchy under his authority through careful organization. In Spain, his influence was unrivaled, and gradually, even the more distant realms of the West came to acknowledge his spiritual supremacy. He refrained from pursuing the claims of political sovereignty that Gregory VII had once asserted. With secular rulers, he exercised patience and restraint to the fullest extent. By 1095, Urban had firmly established himself as the spiritual leader of Western Christendom. Meanwhile, Urban shifted his focus toward the Eastern Church. Following Robert Guiscard's death, his brother Roger of Sicily emerged as the leading figure among the Normans. Roger had no desire to further antagonize Byzantium, and with his cooperation, Urban initiated negotiations with the Byzantine court. At the Council of Melfi in September 1089, in the presence of imperial envoys, Urban lifted the excommunication of Emperor Alexius. In response, Alexius convened a synod in Constantinople that same month. The The synod concluded that the pope's name had been omitted from the diptychs not by any canonical decree, but rather through a kind of negligence. It was proposed that his name could be restored once a systatic letter was received from the pope. The synod saw no real grounds for dispute between the churches and recommended that the patriarchs of Alexandria and Jerusalem also be consulted. The Patriarch of Antioch was present at the gathering in person. Patriarch Nicholas III of Constantinople wrote to Urban, informing him of these decisions and requesting that he send his systatic letter within 18 months. He assured the Pope that the Latin churches in Constantinople were free to maintain their own customs. No mention was made of any theological controversies. However, this approach displeased the emperor's ambassadors in Italy, Greek clerics concerned by papal advances into their regions. They were particularly disturbed when Urban asserted, with some historical justification, that Thessalonica should fall under his jurisdiction. These envoys would have preferred that Alexius side with the anti-pope. But Alexius, recognizing who was the stronger leader, pragmatically accepted the loss of Byzantine Italy. Meanwhile, Guibert, the anti-pope, quickly alienated his Greek supporters by convening a council in Rome that condemned clerical marriage. Urban never did send the systatic letter, likely because he wished to avoid raising theological issues. As a result, his name was never added back into the Constantinople diptychs. Nevertheless, relations between East and West improved. In 1090, a Byzantine embassy visited Urban bearing a message of goodwill from Alexius. The Byzantine perspective was further expressed in a treatise by Theophylact, Archbishop of Bulgaria, who urged his readers not to exaggerate the significance of differing liturgical practices. He regretted the addition of filioque to the creed, but attributed it to the limitations of Latin theological language, which often led to misunderstanding. He dismissed any serious papal claim of authority over the Eastern churches, suggesting that there was no real reason for a schism to occur. Other Eastern theologians continued to debate differences in liturgical customs, but their writings remained moderate in tone. Among them was Simeon II, Patriarch of Jerusalem, who criticized the Latin use of unleavened bread for communion, though without any harsh rhetoric. In early 1095, Pope Urban II departed Rome and called for the first major council of his pontificate, summoning representatives from the entire Western Church to meet him at Piacenza in March. The council passed decrees against simony, clerical marriage, and schism within the Church. The case of King Philip of France's adultery was discussed, though action was deferred until Urban could travel to France himself. Envoys arrived from Emperor Henry's son, Conrad, seeking to arrange a meeting with the Pope at Cremona. Empress Praxedis of Russia, from the Scandinavian dynasty ruling in Kiev, came in person to describe the humiliations she had endured at the hands of her husband. The council served as the supreme court of Western Christendom, with the Pope presiding as its chief judge. Among the visitors attending the council were envoys from Emperor Alexius. His campaigns against the Turks were progressing favorably. The Seljuk power was clearly weakening, and a few well-timed offensives might shatter it entirely. Yet his empire still faced a severe shortage of soldiers. The traditional recruiting grounds in Anatolia were disrupted, many of them now lost. As a result, he relied heavily on foreign mercenaries. Regiments of Pecheneg and other steppe tribes served primarily as border guards and military police, while the Varangian Guard, still largely composed of Anglo-Saxon exiles from Norman-conquered England, formed his elite force. In addition, he employed bands of Western adventurers who temporarily served in his army. The most notable among these had been Count Robert I of Flanders, who had fought for Alexius in 1090. But even with the native forces still available to him, Alexius found his military resources insufficient. The long Danube frontier required constant vigilance against raids from northern barbarian tribes. In the northwest, the Serbs remained restless, and the Bulgarian subjects of the empire were rarely quiet for long. The threat of Norman aggression from Italy also loomed continuously. In Asia Minor, defending the vague and unstable frontiers, maintaining the distant outposts, and ensuring communication lines demanded much of his remaining strength. If Alexius was to launch an offensive campaign, he urgently needed more recruits. His diplomatic outreach to the papacy was intended to secure papal influence in raising these additional forces. Urban was receptive to his appeal. It fit well within the papal strategy to redirect the bellicose energies of the Western Knights toward a distant and sacred cause. The Byzantine ambassadors were invited to address the council assembly. Although their speeches have not survived, it appears that, to persuade the audience of the righteousness of fighting under the emperor, they emphasized the sufferings endured by Eastern Christians as long as the infidels remained unchecked. Simply offering soldiers the promise of good wages would not suffice to inspire widespread recruitment. An appeal to Christian duty provided a far more compelling incentive. This was not the time for a detailed analysis of Byzantine motives or successes. Instead, the envoys sought to leave the bishops with the impression that Christendom remained under serious threat. Inspired by this sense of urgency, the bishops would be eager to send men from their congregations eastward to join the Christian army. The bishops were deeply moved by the message. As Urban traveled onward to Cremona to receive the homage of young Conrad, and then crossed the Alpine passes into France, a grander vision began to take shape in his mind: the prospect of a holy war. Pope Urban arrived in France in the late summer of 1095. On August 5th, he was in Valence, reaching Le Puy on August 11th. From there, he dispatched letters to the bishops of France and nearby regions, summoning them to gather at Clermont in November. Meanwhile, he traveled south, spending September in Provence, visiting Avignon and St. Gilles. In early October, he arrived in Lyons, then proceeded into Burgundy. On October 25th, at Cluny, he consecrated the high altar of the great basilica begun by Abbot Hugh. From Cluny, he continued on to Souvigny, near Moulins, to honor the tomb of the most venerated Cluniac abbot, St. Miles. There, the Bishop of Clermont joined him to escort him to his episcopal city, where preparations for the council were underway. As he journeyed, Urban actively attended to the affairs of the church in France. But his travels also allowed him to further pursue his larger vision. It is unclear whether he personally met Raymond of St. Gilles, Count of Toulouse and Marquis of Provence, who was already renowned for leading holy wars in Spain. However, Urban was certainly in communication with him and aware of his experiences. At Cluny, he also conversed with individuals familiar with pilgrim routes, both to Compostela and Jerusalem, who described the severe hardships faced by pilgrims to Palestine due to the collapse of Turkish authority. Urban learned that not only were the routes across Asia Minor impassable, but the Holy Land itself was effectively closed to pilgrims. The Council of Clermont convened from November 18th to November 28th, 1095. Around 300 clerics attended, addressing a broad range of issues. Decrees were reaffirmed against lay investiture, simony, and clerical marriage, while the truce of God was promoted. King Philip of France was excommunicated for adultery. The Bishop of Cambrai was condemned for simony, and the primacy of the See of Lyons over Sens and Reims was confirmed. But Urban intended to use the council for a far more significant purpose. It was announced that on Tuesday, November 27th, he would hold a public session to deliver a great proclamation. The crowds were so large that they could not be contained within the cathedral where the council's earlier sessions had been held. A platform was erected outside the eastern gate of the city, and there, before the gathered multitude, Urban rose to address them. For contemporary chroniclers have preserved accounts of Urban's speech. Robert the monk claims to have been present, while Baudry of Dole and Fulcher of Chartres write as though they had witnessed it firsthand. The fourth, Guibert of Nogent, likely based his version on second-hand information. None claim to record Urban's exact words, and each account, written years later, reflects the influence of subsequent events. Thus, we can only approximate what Urban actually said. He likely began by emphasizing the urgent need to assist their fellow Christians in the East. The Eastern Church had appealed for aid, as the Turks were advancing into Christian lands, brutalizing the population and defiling sacred sites. Urban spoke not only of Byzantium, but also of Jerusalem, highlighting its exceptional holiness and describing the torments suffered by pilgrims trying to reach it. After portraying these dire circumstances, he issued his momentous call. Western Christendom, he urged, must rise to defend the East. Rich and poor alike should take up the cause. Instead of warring against one another, they should fight a just war in service of God, who would guide them. For those who perished in battle, there would be absolution and forgiveness of sins. Life at home, he warned, was full of misery and vice, leaving men physically and spiritually broken. In the East, however, they would find joy, prosperity, and true friendship with God. There must be no hesitation. They should prepare to depart when summer arrived, with God leading the way. Urban spoke with passion and the skill of a master orator. The response was swift and overwhelming. Shouts of Deus le Volt interrupted his address. Hardly had the Pope finished speaking when the Bishop of Le Puy stood up, knelt before the papal throne, and begged permission to join the sacred expedition. Hundreds immediately followed his example, crowding forward to make their own pledges. Then Cardinal Gregory dropped to his knees and recited the Confiteor aloud, which was repeated in unison by the vast assembly. When the prayer concluded, Urban stood again, granted absolution, and dismissed the gathering. The enthusiasm exceeded what Urban had anticipated. His plans for channeling this excitement were not yet fully in place. No prominent secular lord had been present at Clermont. Those volunteering so far were primarily men of humbler status. Stronger support from leading nobles would be essential. Meanwhile, Urban reconvened his bishops for further deliberation. The council, likely at his earlier urging, had already decreed that those who took part in the holy war with sincere intentions would be granted remission from temporal penalties for their sins. Now additional measures were adopted. The property of participants would be placed under the Church's protection for the duration of their absence. The local bishop would be responsible for safeguarding these belongings and returning them intact upon the warrior's return. Every participant was to wear the symbol of the cross as a sign of his dedication. Each man who took the cross vowed to journey to Jerusalem. If he abandoned the expedition prematurely or failed to depart, he would face excommunication. Clergy and monks were forbidden to join the campaign without permission from their bishop or abbot. The elderly and infirm were to be discouraged from attempting the journey, and no one should undertake it without first consulting his spiritual advisor. This was not to be a war of conquest. In every city reclaimed from the infidels, the Eastern churches were to have their rights and possessions fully restored. All participants were to be ready to depart by the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th of the following year, after the harvests were complete. The armies were to gather at Constantinople. A leader for the expedition had to be chosen. Urban wished to ensure that the campaign remained under church authority, so its head would be an ecclesiastical figure. With the unanimous approval of the council, he appointed the Bishop of Le Puy. Adhemer de Monteil, Bishop of Le Puy, came from the noble family of the Counts of Valentinois. He was a middle-aged man who had previously completed a pilgrimage to Jerusalem 9 years earlier. He earned this leadership role by being the first to answer Urban's call. However, since he had hosted Urban at Le Puy that August and likely discussed matters of the East with him then, it is possible that his dramatic gesture had been partly prearranged. Regardless, it was a wise selection. In the months to come, Adhemer proved to be an excellent preacher and a skilled diplomat, broad-minded, composed, and gracious. He consistently worked to temper passions and promote goodwill, though at times he lacked the firmness necessary to fully control the powerful nobles who were theoretically subject to his leadership. The first of the great lords to request participation in the expedition was Count Raymond of Toulouse. On December 1st, while Urban was still at Clermont, messengers arrived with news that Raymond and many of his nobles were eager to take the cross. Since Raymond was at Toulouse at the time, he could not have heard about the momentous speech at Clermont. As the first noble informed of the project and the first to take the vow, Raymond believed he was entitled to assume secular leadership over the other great lords. He envisioned himself as the Moses to Adhemer's Aaron. Urban, however, would not recognize such a claim, though Raymond never fully relinquished his ambition. Nevertheless, he intended to work loyally alongside Edhemer. Urban departed Clermont on December 2nd. After visiting various Cluniac monasteries, he spent Christmas at Limoges, where he preached the Crusade in the cathedral. Then, traveling north through Poitiers, he reached the Loire Valley. In March, he arrived in Tours, where he held a council. One Sunday, he summoned a large gathering to a meadow along the riverbank. Standing on an improvised platform, he delivered a long and solemn sermon, calling on his audience to repent and join the crusade. From Tours, Urban traveled south again, passing through Aquitaine, Saintes, and Bordeaux before arriving in Toulouse. He remained in Toulouse throughout May and June, giving him ample opportunity to discuss the crusade with his host, Count Raymond. In late June, the Pope continued on to Provence, accompanied by Raymond as far as Nîmes. By August, Urban had crossed the Alps back into Lombardy. This journey was far from a leisurely tour. Throughout his travels, Urban held numerous meetings with church officials and wrote letters, tirelessly pursuing the reorganization of the church in France and, most importantly, advancing his plans for the crusade. Synodal letters containing the decisions made at Clermont were sent to bishops across the West. In some areas, provincial councils convened to receive these decrees and consider local implementation. It is likely that major secular leaders were also officially informed of the Pope's intentions. From Limoges, at the end of 1095, Urban addressed all the faithful in Flanders, referring them to the acts of the council at Clermont and calling for their support. The response from Flanders and nearby regions was overwhelmingly positive. In July 1096, while Urban was at Nîmes, King Philip sent a message announcing his complete submission regarding his previous adultery. That same month, Raymond of Toulouse demonstrated his commitment by donating much of his property to the monastery of St. Gilles. It may have been on Raymond's advice that Urban recognized the need for a maritime power to support the expedition supply lines. Accordingly, 2 papal legates traveled to Genoa with letters requesting the Republic's cooperation. Genoa agreed to provide 12 galleys and transport ships, but cautiously postponed their deployment until they could assess whether the crusade was a serious and viable endeavor. It was only in July 1097 that this fleet finally set sail from Genoa. In the meantime, many Genoese citizens took the cross themselves. By the time Urban returned to Italy, the success of his initiative was assured. His call had been enthusiastically answered. From places as distant as Scotland, Denmark, and Spain, men rushed to take their vows. Some financed their journey by pawning their possessions and land, while others, believing they would never return, surrendered everything to the church. A substantial number of prominent nobles had joined the crusade, providing it with significant military strength. Alongside Raymond of Toulouse and Hugh of Vermandois, Robert of Flanders, Robert, Duke of Normandy, and his brother-in-law Stephen, Count of Blois, were preparing to depart. Even more striking was the participation of men loyal to Emperor Henry IV, chief among them Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, who took the cross along with his brothers, Eustace, Count of Boulogne, and Baldwin. Around these leaders gathered numerous minor nobles and a few prominent clergy, including the Bishop of Bayeux. In Italy, Urban found similar zeal. In September 1096, he wrote to the city of Bologna, expressing gratitude for their enthusiasm, but cautioning them not to depart for the east without permission from their priests. Newly married men, he advised, should not leave without their wives' consent. Meanwhile, word of the crusade reached southern Italy, where many Normans, always eager for new ventures, welcomed it enthusiastically. Initially, the princes hesitated, but Bohemond, son of Guiscard and now Prince of Taranto, soon recognized the opportunity the crusade offered. He took the cross along with many relatives and friends, bringing with him some of the most skilled and ambitious soldiers in Europe. When Urban returned to Rome in time for Christmas 1096, he could be confident that the crusade had truly begun. In reality, he had initiated a movement far greater than he could have foreseen. It might have been better if fewer powerful lords had answered his call. although most, apart from Bohemond, were driven primarily by genuine religious zeal. Their worldly ambitions and rivalries would soon create challenges far beyond the papal legate's ability to manage. Even more difficult to control was the overwhelming response from common people throughout France, Flanders, and the Rhineland. The Pope had instructed his bishops to preach the Crusade, but the most effective preaching came from humble evangelicals, such as Robert of Arbrissel, founder of the Order of Fontevraud, and, even more so, from a wandering monk named Peter. Peter, an elderly man born near Amiens, had likely attempted a pilgrimage to Jerusalem a few years earlier, only to be mistreated by the Turks and forced to abandon his journey. His contemporaries called him Little Peter, but he became better known to history as Peter the Hermit, named after the simple hermit's cloak he always wore. Short, dark, with a long, thin face that resembled the donkey he rode, Peter cut a peculiar figure. He went barefoot, wore filthy clothes, ate no bread or meat, only fish, and drank wine. Yet, despite his humble appearance, he had an extraordinary ability to move people. There was an undeniable aura of strange authority about him. As Guibert of Nogent, who knew him personally, remarked, whatever he said or did, it seemed almost half divine. Peter likely had not been present at the Council of Clermont. However, by the end of 1095, he was already actively preaching the Crusade. He began his mission in Berry and, during February and March, traveled through Orléans and Champagne into Lorraine, then continued past the cities along the Meuse and Aachen, finally reaching Cologne, where he spent Easter. Along the way, he gathered followers, some of whom he dispatched to preach in areas he could not personally visit. Among these were the Frenchmen Walter Sandoir, Reynold of Braise, Geoffrey Burel, and Walter of Breteuil, as well as the Germans Aurel and Gottschalk. Wherever Peter or his disciples appeared, both men and women left their homes to join him. By the time he reached Cologne, his following was estimated at around 15,000 people, with many more joining as he passed through Germany. The astonishing success of Peter's preaching can be attributed to multiple factors. Life for peasants in northwestern Europe was harsh and unstable. Large portions of land had fallen into disuse due to the barbarian invasions and Viking raids. Dikes had been breached, allowing the sea and rivers to reclaim fertile ground. Many lords resisted efforts to clear the forests, preferring to preserve their hunting grounds. Villages lacking the protection of a lord's castle were vulnerable to attacks from outlaws or marauding soldiers engaged in local feuds. Though the church tried to assist the poor and establish new settlements in unoccupied lands, its efforts were inconsistent and often ineffective. While some powerful lords promoted the growth of towns, minor nobles frequently opposed such developments. The existing manorial system was deteriorating, yet no new structure was taking its place. Though serfdom had largely disappeared, peasants remained bound to the land through obligations they could not easily escape. At the same time, population growth made it impossible to continue subdividing the already meager plots of farmland. As Urban reportedly stated at Clermont, according to Robert the monk, in this land you can scarcely feed the people. That is why you consume its resources and wage endless wars against one another. Recent years had been particularly harsh, with floods and pestilence in 1094 followed by drought and famine in 1095. At such a time, emigration held a powerful appeal. Indeed, a meteor shower in April 1095 was seen as a divine sign foreshadowing a great movement of people. Apocalyptic beliefs further fueled the desire to depart. It was an age filled with visions, and many regarded Peter as a prophet. Medieval Christians firmly believed the second coming was imminent. They felt compelled to repent while there was still time and to perform good deeds. The church taught that pilgrimage could atone for sin, and various prophecies insisted that the Holy Land must be reclaimed for the faith before Christ's return. Moreover, to many uneducated believers, the difference between Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem was unclear. Many of Peter's listeners thought he was leading them out of their present suffering into the biblical land of milk and honey. The journey would be arduous, with the forces of Antichrist to confront, but the ultimate destination was the Golden City of Jerusalem. What Pope Urban truly thought of Peter and the remarkable success of his preaching remains unknown. His letter to the people of Bologna suggests he may have been somewhat uneasy about the unrestrained enthusiasm spreading among the faithful. Still, whether by choice or necessity, he did not stop it from expanding across Italy. Throughout the summer of 1096, a steady trickle of pilgrims, lacking leadership or any form of organization, began making their way eastward. Urban no doubt hoped that these groups, along with Peter's followers, would safely reach Constantinople and wait there for the arrival of his legate and the appointed military leaders, who would incorporate them into the structured ranks of the greater Crusader army. Urban's firm instruction that the expedition should gather at Constantinople reveals his confidence that Emperor Alexius would welcome their arrival. After all, Byzantium had requested military assistance from the West. However, Urban's optimism was somewhat naive. While any government may desire allies, it becomes wary when those allies march massive armies into its territory, demanding to be fed, housed, and provided for. Such developments naturally prompted anxiety and alarm in Constantinople once word of the crusading movement reached the imperial court. By 1096, the Byzantine Empire had been enjoying a rare period of calm. The emperor had recently crushed a Cuman invasion of the Balkans so thoroughly that none of the nomadic tribes from the steppes dared to challenge the border again for some time. In Asia Minor, a series of civil wars had begun to unravel the power of the Seljuk Empire. Alexius was preparing to launch an offensive against the weakened Turks, but he preferred to choose the timing of his campaign carefully. His resources remained strained, and he needed additional time to rebuild. A shortage of manpower was one of his chief concerns. Mercenaries from the West were highly desirable, and he likely hoped that his ambassadors in Italy were successful in recruiting individual knights and small detachments. Instead, he now learned that entire Frankish armies were on the march. This was not welcome news. The Franks, as Alexius knew from experience, were a volatile people. Their strength in battle was undeniable, but under these circumstances, such strength posed its own risks. The imperial court was uneasy, and as the Princess Anna Comnena described it, all the West and all the barbarian peoples from beyond the Adriatic to the Pillars of Hercules were moving together across Europe toward Asia, bringing even their families along. Both the emperor and his subjects grew increasingly apprehensive. As a kind of ominous sign, vast swarms of locusts swept over the empire. Strangely, they spared the wheat fields but ravaged the vineyards. Influenced perhaps by imperial officials eager to calm public fears, local soothsayers interpreted the event to mean that the Franks, like the locusts, would leave true Christians unharmed but would devastate the Saracens, whose indulgent nature was represented by the vine. Princess Anna herself was somewhat skeptical of this comforting interpretation. Nevertheless, the comparison between the Franks and the locust swarms was hard to ignore. Emperor Alexius calmly began to prepare for the arrival of the Frankish armies. As these forces would need to be supplied with food while passing through the empire, it was essential to prevent them from plundering the countryside or harming the local population. Provisions were stockpiled at key locations along their projected routes, and special policing units were assigned to meet each contingent upon its entry into imperial territory, escorting them safely to Constantinople. Two main routes crossed the Balkan Peninsula. The northern route entered at Belgrade, continuing southeast through Niš, Sofia, Philippopolis, and Adrianople. The second route was the Via Egnatia, stretching from Dyrrhachium through Akrida and Edessa, Vodina, to Thessalonica, and then on to Mosinopolis and Salimbria before reaching the capital. Since the large German pilgrimage of 1064, the northern route had seen little use by Western travelers. The numbers of pilgrims had declined, and those who made the journey typically favored the Via Egnatia instead. Furthermore, because Alexius was receiving most of his information about the Crusade from Italy, he reasonably expected that the majority of the Frankish forces would cross the Adriatic Sea and follow the Via Egnatia. To prepare, supplies were sent ahead to Dyrrhachium and the cities along this route. The governor of Dyrrhachium, John Comnenus, was instructed to extend a warm welcome to the Frankish leaders, while ensuring that their movements were constantly monitored by the military police. Senior envoys from Constantinople would be dispatched to greet each arriving commander. Meanwhile, Admiral Nicholas Mavrocordakalon took a fleet into the Adriatic to patrol the coastline and give advance warning of any incoming Frankish transports. The emperor himself remained in Constantinople, awaiting further reports. Since the Pope had scheduled the expedition to depart on August 15th, Alexius believed he still had ample time to complete his preparations. But unexpectedly, at the end of May 1096, a messenger arrived hastily from the north with alarming news. The first Frankish army had already crossed through Hungary and entered imperial territory at Belgrade. Peter the Hermit reached Cologne with his followers on Holy Saturday, April 12, 1096. There, he began to grasp the challenges facing a leader of a mass popular movement. The immense and diverse crowd he had gathered included people from various regions and social backgrounds. Some brought their wives and children. Most were peasants, but there were also townspeople, younger sons of noble families, former outlaws, and criminals. Their shared bond was the intensity of their religious zeal. Having forsaken all their possessions to follow Peter, they were eager to press onward. Moreover, it was necessary to keep them moving in order to feed them, as few regions in medieval Europe had enough surplus provisions to sustain such a large group for long. Cologne, however, stood amidst fertile lands with excellent river transport, and Peter saw an opportunity to pause and preach to the local Germans. He likely hoped to attract some of the regional nobility to his cause. In France and Flanders, knights preferred to enlist under powerful lords, but no great German lord had yet joined the crusade. His preaching found success, and several members of the minor German nobility responded, including Count Hugh of Tübingen, Count Henry of Schwarzenberg, Walter of Teck, and the three sons of the Count of Zimmern. The Frenchmen, however, were impatient. Walter Sanzawar decided not to delay in Cologne. Shortly after the Easter celebration, likely on Easter Tuesday, he departed with several thousand compatriots, setting out toward Hungary. Traveling up the Rhine and the Neckar, and then following the Danube, they reached Hungary's frontier by May 8th. There, Walter sent a request to King Koloman for safe passage and provisions. Koloman received them kindly, allowing them to cross Hungary peacefully. By the end of May, they reached Semlin on the far border, crossed the river Save, and entered Byzantine territory at Belgrade. The commander at Belgrade was caught off guard. Having received no instructions on how to handle such an influx, he hurriedly dispatched a message to Niš, where the Bulgarian provincial governor resided, to report Walter's arrival. The governor, a dutiful but undistinguished official named Nicetas, was equally unprepared. He in turn sent a courier racing to Constantinople with the news. Meanwhile, Walter's forces at Belgrade demanded food. As the harvest had yet to be gathered, the garrison could not provide enough supplies, and Walter's followers began looting the surrounding countryside. Tensions had already been heightened by an earlier incident at Semlin, where 16 of Walter's men were captured by Hungarians. These men were stripped of their weapons and clothing, which were then hung on the walls of Semlin as a warning before the captives were sent naked across the river to Belgrade. When the pillaging near Belgrade commenced, the commander responded with force. In the ensuing conflict, several of Walter's men were killed, and some were burned alive inside a church. Walter was eventually able to proceed to Niš, where Nicetas welcomed him and provided food, keeping him there until instructions arrived from Constantinople. The emperor, who had believed the crusade would not depart from the west until the Feast of the Assumption, was forced to accelerate his preparations. Nicetas was ordered to send Walter forward under escort. Accompanied by these escorts, Walter and his followers continued their journey peacefully. In early July, they reached Philippopolis, where Walter's uncle, Walter of Poissy, passed away, and by mid-month, they arrived in Constantinople. From Walter, Nicetas likely learned that Peter was not far behind, leading a significantly larger group. Nicetas, therefore, traveled up to Belgrade to meet him and establish communication with the Hungarian governor of Semlin. Peter had left Cologne around April 20th. Although at first the Germans had mocked his preaching, thousands eventually joined him, bringing his following to nearly 20,000 men and women. Other Germans, inspired by Peter's fervor, planned to follow later under the leadership of Gottschalk and Count Emich of Leisingen. From Cologne, Peter followed the usual route along the Rhine and Neckar to the Danube. Upon reaching the Danube, some of his followers chose to continue by boat down the river, while Peter and the bulk of his group continued overland along the road south of Lake Ferdo, entering Hungary at Odenburg. Peter, as always, rode his donkey. The German knights were on horseback, and wagons carried supplies and a chest containing funds raised for the journey. The majority of his followers, however, traveled on foot. Where the roads permitted, they managed to cover around 25 miles each day. King Koloman received Peter's messengers with the same kindness he had shown Walter, warning them only that any acts of looting would be punished. The army peacefully crossed Hungary during late May and early June. Somewhere near Karlovci, the detachments that had traveled by boat rejoined the main body. On June 20th, they arrived at Semlin. There, their troubles began. The exact sequence of events remains unclear. It seems that the local governor, who was of Guz Turk origin, was alarmed by the size of Peter's army. In coordination with his counterpart across the frontier, he sought to tighten security. Peter's followers grew suspicious. They heard rumors about the hardships suffered by Walter's men and feared a plot against them by the two governors. They were also disturbed by the sight of the weapons taken from Walter's 16 men still displayed on Semlin city walls. Still, matters might have remained peaceful had it not been for a quarrel over the sale of a pair of shoes. This minor dispute escalated into a riot, which soon turned into open battle. Probably against Peter's wishes, his men, led by Geoffrey Burel, assaulted the town and managed to capture the citadel. 4,000 Hungarians were killed, and a large stockpile of provisions was seized. Fearing the retaliation of the Hungarian king, Peter's army quickly hurried across the Save River into Byzantine territory. They gathered as much wood as they could from the abandoned houses to construct rafts for crossing the river. Nicetas, observing anxiously from Belgrade, attempted to regulate the crossing by forcing them to use a single ford. His troops consisted primarily of Pecheneg mercenaries, reliable men who followed orders without question. He dispatched them in barges to prevent crossings at any unauthorized points. Recognizing that his forces were insufficient to control such a vast crowd, Nicetas withdrew to Niš, where the military headquarters of the province were located. Following his departure, the inhabitants of Belgrade fled the city, seeking refuge in the mountains. On June 26th, Peter's army forced its way across the Save River. When the Pechenegs attempted to confine them to one crossing point, they were attacked. Several of their boats were sunk, and the soldiers aboard were captured and executed. Once across, the Crusaders entered Belgrade, looted it thoroughly, and set it ablaze. They then marched for 7 days through dense forests, arriving at Niš on July 3rd. Upon arrival, Peter promptly sent a request to Nicetas for food supplies. Nicetas had already informed Constantinople of Peter's approach and was awaiting the arrival of imperial officials and military escorts to guide the Westerners to the capital. Although Niš had a substantial garrison, bolstered by additional locally recruited Pecheneg and Hungarian mercenaries, Nicetas likely could not spare troops to escort Peter's group until reinforcement from Constantinople arrived. However, allowing such a massive crowd to linger in Niš was impractical and dangerous. Therefore, Peter was asked to provide hostages while food was gathered for his followers and to resume the march as soon as possible. Initially, everything proceeded smoothly. Geoffrey Burel and Walter of Breteuil were handed over as hostages. The local citizens not only permitted the Crusaders to obtain provisions, but also gave alms to the poorer pilgrims, with some even expressing a desire to join the journey. The following morning, the Crusaders resumed their march toward Sofia. As they were leaving Niš, some Germans who had quarreled with the townsmen the night before deliberately set fire to a cluster of mills by the river. Upon hearing of this, Nicetas dispatched troops to attack the rear of the column and capture some prisoners to hold as hostages. Peter, riding his donkey about a mile ahead, was unaware of the incident until a man named Lambert ran from the rear to inform him. He quickly returned to negotiate with Nicetas for the release of the captives. While they were negotiating, rumors of fighting and betrayal spread through the army. A group of impulsive crusaders launched an attack on Nisha's fortifications. The garrison repelled them and then counterattacked, as Peter, trying to calm the situation, attempted to re-establish dialogue with Nicetas. Yet another faction resumed the assault. Nicetas then ordered his entire force to strike back at the crusaders, who were completely routed and scattered. Many were killed, and many others were captured and spent the remainder of their lives in captivity nearby. Peter's money chest was also lost in the chaos. Peter himself, along with Reynold of Braise, Walter of Breteuil, and about 500 survivors, fled to the mountains, believing themselves to be the sole survivors. However, the following morning, 7,000 others regrouped and joined them. Continuing their march, they paused at the deserted town of Bela Palanka to gather the local harvest, as they were without provisions. There, additional stragglers caught up with the group. Even so, they discovered that they had lost about a quarter of their original number. They arrived in Sofia on July 12th. There they encountered the envoys and the military escort dispatched from Constantinople, who were instructed to keep the pilgrims well-provisioned and to ensure that they never lingered in any one place for more than 3 days. From that point forward, their journey proceeded without incident. The local population welcomed them warmly. At Philippopolis, the Greeks were so moved by tales of their hardships that they generously offered money, horses, and mules. Just 2 days outside of Adrianople, additional envoys met Peter, delivering a gracious message from the emperor. It was declared that the crimes of the expedition would be forgiven, as they had already suffered enough. Peter was overwhelmed with gratitude, shedding tears of joy at the benevolence shown by such a powerful ruler. The emperor's goodwill continued even after the Crusaders reached Constantinople on August 1st. Curious to meet the leader of this movement, Alexius summoned Peter to his court, where he provided him with money and sound counsel. Yet to Alexius's experienced eye, the expedition appeared undisciplined and ill-prepared. He feared that if they crossed into Asia, they would be swiftly defeated by the Turks. Their lawlessness prompted him to expedite their removal from the vicinity of Constantinople. The Crusaders committed constant thefts, breaking into suburban villas and palaces, even stripping lead from the roofs of churches. Though access into the city itself was carefully controlled, with only small groups allowed through the gates at a time, it was impossible to police the entire surrounding area. Walter Sandoval and his followers were already in Constantinople, and around the same time, various groups of Italian pilgrims arrived as well. They joined Peter's contingent, and on August 6th, the entire force was transported across the Bosphorus. Once on the Asiatic shore, they advanced along the Sea of Marmora toward Nicomedia, moving in a disorderly fashion, looting houses and churches along the way. Nicomedia, abandoned since its sack by the Turks 15 years earlier, lay empty. Their internal conflicts erupted between the Germans and Italians on one side and the French on the other. The Germans and Italians broke away from Peter's leadership and appointed an Italian nobleman named Reynold as their commander. Both groups proceeded westward along the southern coast of the Gulf of Nicomedia, arriving at a fortified camp called Sabotos by the Greeks, known as Civitate by the Crusaders. This camp had been prepared by Alexius for his English mercenaries near Helenopolis. Its fertile surroundings and proximity to Constantinople made it an ideal encampment, with supplies easily delivered by sea. Alexius had strongly advised Peter to wait for the arrival of the main crusading forces before launching any attacks against the infidels, and Peter himself was convinced of the wisdom of this counsel. However, Peter's influence over his followers was waning. Both Reynold's Germans and Italians, and the French under Geoffrey Burel, failed to maintain discipline. Instead of resting and rebuilding their strength, they competed in raiding the surrounding countryside. They first plundered the immediate area and then ventured into Turkish-controlled territory, looting villages inhabited by Christian Greeks. In mid-September, several thousand Frenchmen advanced as far as the outskirts of Nicaea, the capital of the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan ibn Suleiman. They sacked the suburban villages, seized flocks and herds, and inflicted horrific brutality on the Christian population. Reports claim that they roasted infants on spits. A Turkish force dispatched from Nicaea was repelled after intense fighting. The raiders then returned to Civitate, selling their plunder to fellow crusaders and Greek sailors stationed near the camp. The lucrative raid by the French sparked jealousy among the Germans. Toward the end of September, Reynold led a German force of approximately 6,000 men, including priests and even bishops beyond Nicaea. As they advanced, they plundered the countryside, but, unlike the French, showed mercy to the local Christians. They eventually reached a castle known as Zeragordan, which they successfully seized. Discovering it well-stocked with supplies of every kind, they intended to use it as a base for further raids into the surrounding region. Upon hearing of the Crusaders' capture of Zeragordan, the Sultan dispatched a high-ranking commander with a substantial force to reclaim the stronghold. Zeragordan was situated atop a hill, with its water sources exposed to enemy control. The Turkish army arrived on St. Michael's Day, September 29th, easily defeating an ambush set by Reynold and securing both water sources. Trapped inside the castle, the Germans soon suffered terribly from thirst. They tried to extract moisture from the soil, cut the veins of their horses and donkeys to drink their blood, and even consumed each other's urine. Despite the priests' efforts to console and inspire them, despair grew. After 8 days of unbearable torment, Reynold chose to surrender. He opened the gates after receiving a promise that his life would be spared if he renounced Christianity. Those who remained steadfast in their faith were massacred, while Reynold and those who apostatized were taken captive and transported to Antioch, Aleppo, and far into Khorasan. News of the Germans' capture of Zeragordan reached the Crusader camp at Civitate early in October. Soon after, rumors spread through the camp, claiming that Nicaea itself had fallen and that the Turks were dividing its treasures. As the Turks anticipated, this false report incited wild excitement among the Crusaders, who demanded to march on Nicaea immediately, unaware that the Sultan had laid careful ambushes along the route. The leaders struggled to control their men until the devastating truth of Reynold's failed expedition became known. The initial excitement turned to panic, and the army's leaders convened to decide on their next course of action. Peter had traveled to Constantinople, his authority over the Crusaders having effectively collapsed. He hoped to regain influence by securing substantial support from the emperor. Meanwhile, a faction within the army advocated launching a retaliatory attack to avenge Zeragordan. However, Walter Savoyard persuaded his fellow commanders to wait for Peter's return, which was expected in 8 days. But Peter did not return, and soon reports came that the Turks were advancing towards Civitate. The council met once more. The more cautious leaders advised restraint until Peter's return. Yet Geoffrey Burrell, backed by popular sentiment in the camp, insisted that it would be both cowardly and foolish to delay action against the approaching enemy. His argument prevailed. At dawn on October 21st, the entire Crusader force, numbering over 20,000 men, marched out of Civitate, leaving behind only the elderly, women, children, and the sick. Barely 3 miles from the camp, at the point where the road to Nicaea passed into a narrow wooded valley near the village of Draken, the Turks lay in wait. The Crusaders advanced noisily and carelessly, with their mounted knights leading the column. Suddenly, a volley of arrows burst from the woods, striking down or wounding the horses. As the animals reared and collapsed in confusion, throwing their riders, the Turks launched their attack. The cavalry, driven back and pursued by the Turks, collided with the oncoming infantry. Though many knights fought courageously, they could not prevent the panic that swept through the army. Within moments, The entire force was in chaotic retreat back towards Civitate. In the camp, daily life was just beginning. Some of the elderly were still asleep, while a few priests were celebrating early mass. The fleeing soldiers, followed closely by the enemy, burst into the camp in a frenzied wave. There was no organized resistance. Soldiers, women, and priests were slaughtered before they could even react. Some tried to flee into the surrounding forests or threw themselves into the sea, but few found safety for long. Others made a brief stand by setting fires, which the wind blew into the faces of the attacking Turks. Only young boys and girls who appealed to the Turks were spared, along with a few captives taken once the initial bloodshed subsided. These unfortunate souls were carried off into slavery. Around 3,000 survivors, luckier than most, managed to reach an abandoned castle by the sea. Though long and used, with doors and windows dismantled, the desperate refugees used scattered timber and even bones to create makeshift defenses. Their determination allowed them to withstand repeated Turkish assaults. The castle held firm, but elsewhere the battle was finished by midday. The ground from the pass at Draken to the sea was littered with corpses. Among the fallen were Walter Sanzawar, Reynold of Braise, Fulk of Orleans, Hugh of Tübingen, Walter of Teck, Conrad and Albert of Zimmern, along with many other German knights. The only leaders to survive were Geoffrey Burel Walter of Breteuil, William of Poissy, Henry of Schwarzenberg, Frederick of Zimmern, and Rudolf of Brandis, though most of them were gravely wounded. At nightfall, a Greek who had accompanied the army managed to find a boat and sailed to Constantinople to bring word to Peter and the emperor. No record remains of Peter's reaction, but Emperor Alexius acted immediately. He dispatched warships, manned with strong forces, to Civitate. Upon the arrival of the Byzantine fleet, the Turks lifted the siege of the castle and withdrew inland. The survivors were rescued, brought aboard the ships, and taken back to Constantinople, where they were housed in the suburbs. Thus ended the People's Crusade. It had claimed thousands of lives, severely tested the emperor's patience, and proved that faith alone, without wisdom and discipline, was insufficient to clear the path to Jerusalem. On a day in February, AD 638, Caliph Omar entered Jerusalem atop a white camel. His garments were tattered and dirty, and the soldiers accompanying him were rugged in appearance, yet their discipline was flawless. Walking beside him was Patriarch Sophronius, the chief magistrate of the newly surrendered city. Omar made his way directly to the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon, the very place from which the Prophet Muhammad was believed to have ascended into heaven. As Sophronius observed him standing there, he recalled the words of Christ and whispered through tears, "Behold the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet." Afterward, the caliph requested to visit the Christian holy sites. The patriarch led him to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and guided him through its sacred spaces. While they were still inside, the time for Muslim prayer approached. Omar asked where he might lay down his prayer rug. Sophronius urged him to remain where he stood, but Omar chose instead to step out onto the porch of the Martyrion. He explained that he feared his devout followers might later lay claim to any place in which he had prayed. His caution proved justified. This arrangement followed the conditions set for Jerusalem's surrender. The Prophet Muhammad had declared that while pagans must choose between conversion and death, the people of the book were permitted to maintain their places of worship and practice their faith freely. However, they were not allowed to build new houses of worship, bear arms, or ride horses. They also had to pay a special head tax, the jizya. Sophronius had likely hoped for no better outcome when he ventured out on a donkey under a guarantee of safe conduct to meet Omar on the Mount of Olives, refusing to surrender the city to anyone of lesser rank. Jerusalem had endured a siege lasting over a year. The Arabs, untrained in siege tactics and lacking proper equipment, had failed to breach the city's newly restored defenses. But inside the walls, supplies were dwindling, and no help was expected. The surrounding lands were under Arab control, and town after town in Syria and Palestine had already capitulated. No Christian army remained within reach except the garrison at Caesarea, which held on with the aid of the imperial fleet. Beyond the usual surrender terms, Sophronius secured only a promise that imperial officials in the city could leave safely with their families and belongings, retreating to the coast at Caesarea. This marked the final public act of the patriarch. From his youth, traveling among Eastern monasteries with his companion John Moschus to collect the sayings and stories of the saints for the spiritual meadow, to his reluctant acceptance of the bishopric of Jerusalem under an emperor whose policies he opposed, Sophronius remained a tireless opponent of heresy and divisive nationalism. He had strived to prevent the fragmentation of the empire. Yet, despite being known as the honey-tongued defender of the faith, his efforts ultimately failed. The Arab conquest was a bitter confirmation of this defeat. A few short weeks later, Sophronius died, his heart broken. No human intervention could have prevented the unrest that erupted in Rome's eastern provinces. A long-standing, underlying tension between East and West had marked the history of the Roman Empire. Although the West triumphed at Actium, it was the East that eventually gained the upper hand over its victors. Provinces like Egypt and Syria stood out as the wealthiest and most densely populated in the empire. They were the empire's industrial heartlands, their ships and trade, caravans managing the flow of goods from the East. Their level of cultural development surpassed that of the West, not only because of their ancient traditions, but also due to the cultural stimulation provided by their proximity to Rome's only true rival in civilization, the Sassanid Persian Empire. As time passed, the East's influence continued to rise. Eventually, Emperor Constantine the Great embraced an Eastern religion and relocated the imperial capital to Byzantium on the Bosphorus. In the following century, when internal decay left the empire vulnerable to barbarian invasions, the West collapsed, but the East endured. As new barbarian kingdoms emerged across Gaul, Spain, Africa, remote Britain, and ultimately Italy, the Roman emperor continued to govern the East from Constantinople. Historically, the Roman administration had rarely been popular in Egypt and Syria. However, resentment toward the government in Constantinople grew even more intense. Much of this animosity stemmed from external factors. The economic decline of the West meant fewer markets for Syrian traders and Egyptian artisans. Ongoing wars with Persia disrupted the desert trade routes linking Antioch to the cities of Lebanon. Soon after, the collapse of the Abyssinian kingdom and turmoil in Arabia severed Red Sea trade routes once dominated by Egyptian sailors and caravan leaders from Petra, Transjordan, and southern Palestine. As Constantinople rose to become the empire's chief commercial hub, long-distance trade, encouraged by imperial diplomacy, shifted toward a more northerly path through the steppes of Central Asia. This shift was deeply resented by the merchants of Alexandria and Antioch, who felt increasingly overshadowed by the imperial capital. Their bitterness deepened as the government moved toward greater centralization. Local rights and freedoms were steadily reduced, while tax collection became more aggressive and burdensome than it had been under earlier Roman rule. This climate of discontent reignited Eastern nationalism, a force that never remained dormant for long. Religious conflict eventually brought this simmering struggle into the open. Under pagan emperors, local religious traditions were often tolerated. It was easy to incorporate regional deities into the Roman pantheon. Only the unwavering monotheism of Jews and Christians occasionally provoked persecution. However, Christian emperors could not afford such tolerance. Christianity, by nature, demands exclusivity, and the emperors saw it as a tool to unify their diverse subjects under a single spiritual and political order. Although Constantine was not deeply versed in theological matters, he tried to unify the church during a time when it was divided by the Arian controversy. 50 years later, Emperor Theodosius the Great went further, making religious conformity a cornerstone of imperial policy. But unity was elusive. The East embraced Christianity with great enthusiasm. Greek intellectual traditions brought a love of intricate theological debate, while Hellenized Easterners added a passionate fervor that often turned into intolerance and fanaticism. The central issue in these disputes was the nature of Christ. While theological in nature, these arguments captivated the general public, who treated religious debate as a favorite pastime, second only to the spectacles of the circus. There were deeper social tensions at play as well. Many ordinary Syrians and Egyptians preferred a simpler form of worship and were repelled by the elaborate ceremonies of the Orthodox Church, which they viewed as excessive, especially in light of their growing poverty. Furthermore, they saw the Orthodox clergy as representatives of the imperial authority in Constantinople. Even among the upper clergy, resentment festered. The patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch were outraged to see the relatively new bishop of Constantinople elevated above them in rank. Given this volatile mix of cultural resentment, economic hardship, centralized oppression, and ecclesiastical rivalry, it was perhaps inevitable that religious dissent would arise. And when it did, it took on the character of a nationalist and divisive movement. Arianism quickly faded in the East, surviving only in Abyssinia, but the theological disputes of the 5th century proved to be far more enduring. Early in that century, Nestorius, a Syrian-born patriarch of Constantinople, introduced a doctrine that placed excessive emphasis on the human nature of Christ. This line of thinking had long been favored by theologians of the Antiochene school, and Nestorius gained considerable support in northern Syria. However, his views were officially condemned as heresy at the Council of Ephesus in 431. As a result, numerous congregations in Syria broke away from the church. Outlawed within the Roman Empire, the Nestorians relocated their base to Mesopotamia, within the domain of the Persian king. From there, they focused their efforts on missionary work further east, reaching as far as India, Turkestan, and even China. Yet during the 6th and 7th centuries, they continued to maintain a presence in Syria and Egypt, primarily among merchants involved in Easter trade. The controversy surrounding Nestorianism eventually led to an even more divisive conflict. Triumphant over both the Antiochene theology and a rival patriarch of Constantinople, the theologians of Alexandria swung too far in the opposite direction. They advanced a doctrine that appeared to negate Christ's humanity altogether. This belief, initially proposed by a relatively obscure priest named Eutyches, came to be known as Monophysitism. In 451, it was condemned by the Council of Chalcedon, the fourth of the ecumenical councils. In response, the Monophysites severed ties with the main body of the Christian church. Most Egyptian Christians and a significant number of Syrian congregations sided with the Monophysites. The Armenian Church, whose representatives arrived too late to participate in the council's discussions, also rejected the council's decisions and aligned themselves with the Monophysite cause. Subsequent emperors made repeated efforts to heal the rift, seeking a theological formula that could reconcile the divisions and receive the endorsement of another ecumenical council. However, two major obstacles stood in their way. First, the dissenters were not eager to rejoin the church unless it was on terms that Orthodox leaders found unacceptable. Second, the Roman Church, led by the Pope, strongly opposed any compromise. Pope Leo I, believing it was the duty of the Bishop of Rome to define doctrine, dismissed the intricate theological debates that he struggled to grasp. He issued a straightforward and definitive declaration of orthodoxy, known as the Tome of Leo. Although the document did not address the complexities of the controversy, the Council of Chalcedon adopted it as the foundation for its conclusions. Pope Leo's position was simple and inflexible, leaving no room for nuanced interpretation. Any concession to the dissenters would have required rejecting the Pope's formula, thereby causing a break with Rome. For emperors with political ambitions in Italy or the Western world, such a schism was unacceptable. Trapped in this difficult position, the imperial administration failed to develop a clear or consistent strategy. Instead, it alternated between suppressing the heretics and attempting to win them over. Meanwhile, heretical movements grew stronger in the eastern provinces, bolstered by the resurgence of local nationalist sentiment among Eastern peoples. In addition to the Nestorians and Monophysites, another group in the East posed continual challenges to imperial authority: the Jewish communities. Jews were present in substantial numbers in many major cities across the region. While they faced legal restrictions and were occasionally subjected to violence or property damage during riots, they responded by exploiting any opportunity to harm the Christian population. With their significant financial resources and vast international connections, they were viewed as a persistent and potentially dangerous threat to the state. During the 6th century, conditions in the eastern provinces deteriorated further. Justinian's military campaigns in the west dragged on, draining resources and proving expensive. These conflicts complicated his religious agenda and brought heavier taxes upon the east, without offering any tangible benefits in return. Syria was particularly hard hit. Along with bearing increased fiscal pressure, it endured a string of devastating Persian raids and a series of catastrophic earthquakes. Amid this turmoil, only the heretical movements seemed to thrive. In Syria, the Monophysite community was galvanized into a strong and organized church by Jacob Berdius of Edessa, with crucial support from Empress Theodora. From that point on, the Syrian Monophysites were commonly referred to as the Jacobites. In Egypt, the Monophysites made up nearly the entire native population. Meanwhile, the Nestorians, who were firmly established beyond the Persian border and expanding rapidly eastward, solidified their influence even within the empire. Outside of Palestine's urban centers, Orthodox Christians became a minority. Derisively called the Melkites, they owed their survival to the strength and authority of the imperial government. In 602, a centurion named Phocas seized control of the imperial throne. His reign was marked by brutality and mismanagement. While Constantinople suffered under his tyrannical rule, the provinces descended into chaos, with civil unrest fueled by the rivalries of urban circus factions and deepening divisions among religious sections. In Antioch, the Jacobite and Nestorian patriarchs openly convened a joint council to coordinate efforts against the Orthodox Church. Phocas retaliated by dispatching a military force that massacred large numbers of heretics, aided enthusiastically by the local Jewish population. However, 2 years later, the Jews themselves revolted and executed the Orthodox patriarch of the city in a violent uprising. In 610, Phocas was overthrown by Heraclius, a young nobleman of Armenian heritage and the son of Africa's provincial governor. That same year, the Persian king Khosroes II launched a full-scale invasion aimed at dismantling the empire. The ensuing conflict lasted 19 years. For the first 12 years, the empire was forced into a defensive stance. One Persian army swept across Anatolia, while another overran Syria. Antioch was captured in 611, followed by Damascus in 613. In the spring of 614, Persian general Sharbaraz advanced into Palestine, plundering the countryside and setting churches ablaze. The only church spared was the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, due to a mosaic above its entrance that portrayed the Magi in traditional Persian attire. On April 15th, Sharbaraz laid siege to Jerusalem. Although Patriarch Zacharias was ready to surrender the city peacefully to prevent bloodshed, the Christian citizens refused to concede. On May 5th, with the assistance of Jews from within the city, the Persians breached the defenses. What followed was a scene of immense horror. With homes and churches engulfed in flames, Christians were slaughtered indiscriminately. Reports claimed 60,000 were killed, and an additional 35,000 were enslaved. The city's sacred relics, including the true cross and the instruments associated with the Passion, had been concealed but were eventually discovered. They were taken, along with Patriarch Zacharias, and sent east as a tribute to the Christian queen of Persia, Miriam, who was a Nestorian. The destruction inflicted on Jerusalem and its surrounding areas was so extensive that even centuries later, the region had yet to fully recover. 3 years after their conquest of Jerusalem, the Persian forces advanced into Egypt and swiftly secured control within a year. Meanwhile, their northern campaigns brought them all the way to the Bosphorus. The loss of Jerusalem sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The involvement of the Jewish population in the city's fall left a lasting mark, with memories of their role remaining bitter and unforgiven. The conflict with Persia increasingly took on the character of a religious war. When Emperor Heraclius finally gained the strength to counterattack in 622, he dedicated himself and his army to God, embarking on a campaign as a Christian warrior against the forces of darkness. Later generations would regard him as a precursor to the Crusaders. Indeed, William of Tyre, in his History of the Crusades written centuries later, included the Persian conflict in his account. In fact, the Old French translation of his work was titled The Book of Heraclius. Heraclius's campaign ultimately proved victorious. After numerous setbacks and moments of despair, he delivered a decisive blow to the Persians at the Battle of Nineveh in December 627. In early 628, King Khosrow was assassinated, and his successor sought peace. Although formal peace was not concluded until the following year, the empire eventually regained its lost territories. In August, Heraclius returned to Constantinople in triumph. The next spring, he traveled south to receive the Holy Cross and ceremoniously returned it to Jerusalem. Interestingly, under Persian rule, Eastern Christians had not suffered greatly. Khosrow, after initially supporting the Jews, had soon turned against them and expelled them from Jerusalem. While his court favored the Nestorians, he maintained an official policy of tolerance toward both the Monophysites and the Orthodox. Their churches were rebuilt and restored, and he even sponsored a council in his capital, Ctesiphon, aimed at reconciling the different Christian sects. However, the restoration of imperial authority soon revealed its bias toward the Orthodox Church. Once the initial joy of liberation faded, Syrians and Egyptians saw little benefit. Heraclius had inherited a bankrupt state and had funded his wars with significant loans from the church. The spoils from Persia were insufficient to repay this debt. As a result, heavy taxation resumed, with local populations once again watching their wealth flow into the hands of the Orthodox hierarchy. Heraclius's religious policies further alienated many. Although he harbored no deep-seated hostility toward Jews, his attitude changed after learning of their involvement in the Persian invasions. Influenced perhaps by an old prophecy about a circumcised people bringing ruin to the empire, he ordered the forced baptism of all Jews within imperial territory. He also urged Western rulers to do the same. While the decree was largely unenforceable, it inspired Christian zealots to commit violent acts against Jewish communities, intensifying Jewish resentment of imperial authority. The emperor then turned his attention to theological reconciliation. Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, himself of Syrian Monophysite origin, developed a doctrine intended to bridge the divide between Monophysites and Orthodox believers. With Heraclius's backing, this new doctrine was promoted across the empire following the end of the Persian War. Despite support from the Patriarch and the cautious endorsement of Pope Honorius, it gained little traction. The Monophysite leadership rejected it outright, and many Orthodox believers, led by spiritual figures such as Maximus the Confessor in Constantinople and Sophronius in the East, also opposed it. Heraclius, driven more by zeal than prudence, attempted to impose the doctrine universally. Aside from imperial courtiers and small groups of Armenians and Lebanese Christians, his efforts found little support. In response to the growing rejection, Heraclius revised the doctrine. His ekthesis, issued in 638, presented the idea of monothelitism, which likewise failed to gain acceptance. This theological episode, unresolved until the Sixth Ecumenical Council in 680, only deepened the division and confusion that plagued the Christian communities of the East. In 629, while Heraclius was in Constantinople receiving congratulatory delegations from distant lands like France and India, a letter is said to have reached him from an Arabian tribal leader. This man proclaimed himself as a prophet of God and urged the emperor to embrace his new faith. Similar messages were reportedly sent to the rulers of Persia, Abyssinia, and the governor of Egypt. However, This account is likely legendary. It is doubtful that Heraclius at that time had any real awareness of the momentous changes unfolding across the Arabian Peninsula. At the dawn of the 7th century, Arabia was home to numerous independent and often unruly tribes. The region was steeped in idolatry, with each locality worshipping its own deities. The most revered of all shrines was the Kaaba in Mecca, the leading trading hub. Yet idolatry was already declining. Missionaries representing Judaism, Christianity, and Zoroastrianism had been active in the region for some time. Zoroastrian influence had made headway only in areas under Persian political control, particularly in the northeast and later in the south. Jewish communities thrived in many Arabian towns, especially Medina, and had converted a number of Arabs. Christianity had the widest reach. Orthodox Christian communities existed in Sinai and Patria, while the Nestorians, like the Zoroastrians, were mostly found in regions protected by Persia. The Monophysites had established congregations all along the caravan trade routes, extending down into Yemen and Hadramaut. Significant desert-edge tribes, such as the Banu Ghassan and the Banu Taghlib, were entirely Monophysite. Arab merchants, who frequently traveled to cities in Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, had many opportunities to observe the great religions of the neighboring civilizations. Within Arabia itself, there also persisted an ancient tradition of monotheism known as Hanif. At the same time, there was a growing pressure for expansion. The Arabian Peninsula's meager resources, which had become even more strained after the collapse of the Himyarite irrigation systems, could no longer support its growing population. Historically, desert peoples had often spilled over into neighboring fertile lands. It was in this setting that Muhammad's extraordinary leadership emerged. Born in the sacred city of Mecca, he belonged to the prominent Quraysh clan, though his own family was of modest standing. He had traveled widely, gaining exposure to other cultures and religions, and took a particular interest in Monophysite Christianity. However, he struggled to accept the doctrine of the Trinity, favoring instead the pure monotheism found in the Hanif tradition. The faith he developed did not completely reject Christianity, but instead offered a revised and simplified version that his fellow Arabs could more readily embrace. Muhammad's rise as a spiritual leader stemmed from his deep understanding of his people. Though intellectually far ahead of his peers, he shared their mindset, values, and instincts. His remarkable political acumen only enhanced his influence. Thanks to this blend of insight and skill, within a decade, he built an empire from nothing. When the Hijra occurred in 622, his support base was limited to his household and a small group of loyal followers. By the time of his death in 632, he had united Arabia under his rule, and his armies were already moving beyond its borders. The sudden ascent of charismatic leaders is not rare in the East, but their dominance often fades just as quickly. Muhammad, however, established a lasting system, anchored by the Quran. The Quran, believed by Muslims to be the divine word revealed through the Prophet, not only contains spiritual guidance and stories, but also offers a comprehensive framework for daily life, governance, and law. It was straightforward enough to be accepted by Muhammad's contemporaries and flexible enough to guide the vast empire his successors would create. Islam's enduring strength lay in its clarity: one God in heaven, one earthly ruler, and one unifying law, the Quran. Unlike Christianity, which preached peace yet often failed to realize it, Islam made no apologies for its militant approach. Even during the lifetime of the Prophet, Islamic forces had already begun targeting the Roman Empire's provinces, conducting small, largely unsuccessful raids into Palestine. With the rise of Muhammad's successor, Abu Bakr, a clearer strategy of expansion began to emerge. The Arabian Peninsula was fully brought under control, marked by the removal of Persian influence from Bahrain. An Arab force advanced through Patria along the caravan routes leading to southern Palestine, where they defeated the regional governor, Sergius, near the Dead Sea. They proceeded to capture Gaza after a brief siege. While the local population was treated with leniency, the garrison's soldiers became the first Christian victims of the Islamic sword. In 634, Abu Bakr was succeeded by Omar, who carried on the mission of territorial expansion. At the same time, Emperor Heraclius, still residing in northern Syria, began to understand the gravity of the Arab incursions. However, the empire was suffering from a severe shortage of manpower. The wars against Persia had drained its resources, and many military units had been disbanded afterward to reduce costs. The empire was gripped by a widespread sense of fatigue and despair, a common aftermath for both victors and vanquished following a prolonged and bitter conflict. Despite these challenges, Heraclius dispatched his brother Theodore, leading the troops from the Syrian province, to stabilize the situation in Palestine. Theodore confronted the two principal Arab armies at a place called Gabbatha, southwest of Jerusalem, where he was soundly defeated. With southern Palestine secured, the Arabs moved north along the trade route running east of the Jordan River toward Damascus and the Orontes Valley. Cities like Tiberias, Baalbek, and Homs surrendered without resistance, and Damascus fell after a short siege in August 635. Now deeply concerned, Heraclius managed with difficulty to send two additional armies southward. One force, composed of Armenian troops under Prince Vahan and a significant contingent of Christian Arabs, led by a sheikh from the Banu Ghassan, was dispatched alongside another under the command of Theodore Tritherius, composed of a mix of imperial forces. Upon hearing of their advance, the Muslims temporarily withdrew from the Orontes Valley and Damascus, retreating toward the Jordan River. Tritherius engaged the Muslim forces at Jabiya in the Horan region, but was defeated. Nevertheless, he managed to hold a defensive position near the Yarmouk River, just southeast of the Sea of Galilee, awaiting reinforcements from Vahan's army. On August 20th, 636, during a fierce sandstorm, the decisive confrontation unfolded. Although the Christian forces outnumbered their opponents, they were strategically outflanked. In a dramatic turn during the battle, the Ghassanid leader and 12,000 Christian Arab soldiers defected to the Muslim side. Their allegiance to Monophysitism, their deep resentment toward Heraclius, and months of unpaid wages had made betrayal an easy choice. This act of treachery sealed the fate of the conflict. The Muslim forces achieved a resounding victory. Both Tritherius and Vahan fell in battle, along with nearly all their troops. With this defeat, Palestine and Syria were left exposed to the advancing Muslim armies. When news of the devastating battle reached Heraclius in Antioch, he was overwhelmed by despair. He believed that divine punishment had come upon him for marrying his niece, Martina. Lacking both troops and funds to defend the province any further, he performed a solemn prayer service in Antioch's cathedral. Afterwards, he departed by sea for Constantinople, weeping as he left the coast and bidding a sorrowful farewell to Syria. The Arab forces rapidly swept through the region. Heterodox Christian groups offered little to no resistance, and the Jewish communities actively supported the invaders, even guiding them. Only the major cities of Caesarea and Jerusalem, along with the fortresses of Pella and Dara near the Persian frontier, organized any significant defense. In Jerusalem, upon hearing of the Arab victory at Yarmouk, Sophronius repaired the city's fortifications. As the enemy approached Jericho, he gathered the sacred relics of Christ and sent them under cover of night to the coast. Bound for Constantinople, determined that they would not fall into Muslim hands once more. Jerusalem endured a siege lasting over a year. Caesarea and Dara held out until 639, though by that time they had become isolated outposts. Antioch, the principal city of the East, had fallen the previous year, and nearly the entire region was now under Muslim control. Meanwhile, the Arabs had brought about the downfall of Rome's ancient rival, Persia. Their victory at the Battle of Catastrophic in 637 secured their hold on Iraq, and a subsequent triumph at Navan the following year gave them control of the Iranian plateau. Yazdijerd III, the final Sassanid king, fled to Khorasan, where he remained until 651. By then, Arab forces had reached his eastern borders, extending as far as the Oxus River and the mountains of Afghanistan. In December 639, The Muslim general Amr led a force of 4,000 men into Egypt. Since the end of Persian rule, Egypt had suffered from disorganized administration. Its current governor, Patriarch Cyrus of Alexandria, was both politically inept and morally compromised. A convert from Nestorianism, Cyrus was a staunch supporter of the emperor's monothelite doctrine, which he sought to impose on the resistant Copts. His rule was so deeply resented that Amr had little difficulty in finding local collaborators. In early 640, after a 2-month siege, Amr captured the key frontier fortress of Pelusium, where he was reinforced by additional troops from the Caliph. He then advanced to Babylon, Old Cairo, where Roman forces were concentrated. A confrontation at Heliopolis in August 640 forced the Romans to retreat into Babylon's fortified citadel, which held out until April 641. Meanwhile, Arab forces had taken control of Upper Egypt. Following Babylon's fall, Amr moved through the Fayum, facing no resistance as the governor and garrison fled, and then proceeded toward Alexandria. By that time, Cyrus had been recalled to Constantinople, accused of having negotiated secretly with Amr. After Heraclius's death in February, his widow, Empress Regent Martina, found herself too politically vulnerable to organize a defense of Egypt. Cyrus was sent back with instructions to negotiate peace. In November, he met with Amr at Babylon and signed the treaty surrendering Alexandria. However, the political tides soon shifted. Martina was overthrown, and the new government disavowed both Cyrus and the agreement. Amr had already broken terms by launching campaigns into the Pentapolis and Tripolitania. Despite these complications, it was becoming increasingly clear that Alexandria could not be defended, with the rest of Egypt already under Arab control. The city surrendered in November 642. Yet hope briefly revived in 644 when news arrived that Amr had fallen out of favor and been recalled to Medina. A new imperial army was dispatched by sea from Constantinople, swiftly retaking Alexandria in early 645. The force then advanced toward Fustat, the new city founded by Amr near Babylon. But Amr returned to Egypt, defeating the imperial troops near Fustat. Their commander, the Armenian Manuel, retreated to Alexandria. Disheartened by the complete apathy of the local Christian population, who showed no interest in the Roman effort to reclaim the province, he made no attempt to defend the city and instead sailed back to Constantinople. The Coptic Patriarch Benjamin subsequently handed Alexandria over to Amr. Egypt was permanently lost. By the year 700, Roman control in North Africa had collapsed under Arab conquest. Just over a decade later, they entered Spain. By 717, the Muslim empire stretched from the Pyrenees in the west to central India in the east, and its warriors were already laying siege to the walls of Constantinople. The Eastern Christians accepted the rule of their non-Christian overlords without much resistance. The idea that Byzantium might rise again, as it once did against the Persians, to reclaim the holy sites now seemed unrealistic. The Arabs, unlike the Persians, quickly built a powerful navy based in Alexandria, which allowed them to seize control of the seas from the Byzantines. On land, they maintained the upper hand for nearly 300 years. There seemed to be little hope of salvation coming from the Christian princes of Europe. Moreover, not all Christian groups would have welcomed such intervention. For many heretical sects, the arrival of new rulers brought relief and even joy. The Jacobite Patriarch of Antioch, Michael the Syrian, writing 5 centuries later during the era of the Latin kingdoms, recalled the long-standing belief of his people that God, in his power, raised up the children of Ishmael from the south to free them from Roman rule. He described this deliverance as a great blessing. Similar views were expressed by the Nestorians. An anonymous Nestorian chronicler even wrote that Christians rejoiced under Arab rule, praying for its success and prosperity. The Coptic Christians of Egypt were more reserved in their praise. Their criticism focused less on the Arab religion or people and more on the harshness and deceit of the general Amr, whose governance was marked by cruelty and excessive demands. Even the Orthodox Christians, once they realized that the feared persecution would not come and that the taxes under Muslim rule were lighter than those of Byzantine rule, showed little desire to resist. A few highland tribes, such as the Mardawites of Lebanon and the Taurus Mountains, continued to fight. The Arab conquest ultimately solidified the status of the Eastern churches in their existing roles. Unlike the Christian Byzantine Empire, which had tried to enforce religious conformity across its population, the Arabs were willing to tolerate religious minorities, much like the Persians before them, as long as they belonged to the people of the book. Christians, along with Jews and Zoroastrians, were given the status of dhimmis, or protected peoples. Their religious freedom was secured through the payment of the jizya, initially a personal tax, but later seen as a substitute for military service. Another tax, the carriage, was imposed on land. Each religious community, or millet, operated with a degree of autonomy under its own spiritual leader, who was responsible for the community's conduct before the caliph's authorities. Each group was allowed to keep the places of worship they possessed at the time of the conquest. However, not all rules were strictly enforced. Muslims did appropriate some major churches, such as the Great Cathedral of St. John in Damascus, and many churches and synagogues were periodically destroyed. Still, numerous new ones were also constructed. Later Islamic scholars permitted the dhimmis to build their places of worship, so long as these structures were not taller than Muslim buildings and their religious sounds did not reach Muslim ears. Nonetheless, strict regulations remained. Dhimmis were required to wear distinctive clothing, were forbidden to ride horses, and could not publicly challenge Islamic customs. They were also prohibited from attempting to convert Muslims, marrying Muslim women, or speaking disrespectfully of Islam. Loyalty to the state was a constant expectation. The millet system introduced a different perspective on the idea of nationality. In the Eastern world, nationalism had not traditionally been rooted in race, but rather in shared cultural heritage, geographic location, and economic interests. Under this new system, religious affiliation came to replace national identity. For instance, an Egyptian would not consider himself primarily as a citizen of Egypt, but rather as a Muslim, a Copt, or an Orthodox Christian, depending on his faith. His primary loyalty was to his religion or to his millet. This system favored the Orthodox Christians over the so-called heretical sections. They were still referred to as Melkites, or the emperor's people, and they continued to see themselves that way. Even though they were forced by circumstance to live under non-Christian rulers and follow their laws, they still regarded the Byzantine emperor as God's representative on earth and their true sovereign. St. John of Damascus, who held a government post under the caliph, always addressed the emperor as his lord and master, despite theological disagreements, referring to the caliph merely as the emir. Similarly, Eastern patriarchs writing to Emperor Theophilus in the 9th century, though living under Muslim rule, continued to acknowledge the emperor in these respectful terms. The Byzantine emperors embraced this role. While they had no administrative control over Muslim territories, nor did the Patriarch of Constantinople hold authority over his Eastern counterparts, the emperors still considered it their duty to care for the Orthodox living beyond their borders. In matters of war and diplomacy with the caliphs, the welfare of these Christians was always kept in mind. This was not a matter of direct governance, but rather a powerful and emotional expression of the belief that Christendom remained united and that the emperor symbolized that unity. In contrast, the heretical churches lacked any secular protector. They depended entirely on the favor of the caliph, which limited their influence and reduced their standing. Many of these sects had originally split from Orthodox doctrine in an effort to simplify Christianity for local believers. Islam, bearing many similarities to Christianity and enjoying the advantage of being the religion of the new ruling elite, became an appealing alternative to many of them. Although we have no exact records of how many Christians converted to Islam, it is clear that most converts came from the heretical groups rather than from the Orthodox Church. Within 100 years of the Arab conquest, Syria had become mostly Muslim, though the Orthodox population remained relatively stable. In Egypt, the Copts retained their presence a bit longer due to their wealth, but they too steadily lost ground. Ironically, while the millet system helped preserve the heretical communities, it also made reconciliation and reunification with the Orthodox Church practically impossible. The spread of Islam in Syria and Palestine did not result from a massive migration of Arabs from the desert. The conquering armies were relatively small and primarily established a ruling military elite over the local populations. The demographic makeup of the region remained largely unchanged. Regardless of whether the local people converted to Islam or remained Christian, they gradually adopted Arabic as their common language. Today we refer to their descendants as Arabs, but in reality, they were a mix of many ancient peoples. Arameans had also slowly settled in the area over centuries. Among them were Jews who had joined the early Christian church, such as the first apostles. Only the Jews who continued practicing their religion maintained a clear ethnic identity, though even their lineage had been somewhat diluted over time. In Egypt, the population was more ethnically Hamitic, but it too became more mixed due to intermarriage with Syrians, desert tribes, people from the Upper Nile, and others from across the Mediterranean region. Arab settlement naturally became most concentrated in areas close to the desert and in the cities located along key caravan routes bordering it. With the decline of Mediterranean sea trade that followed the Arab conquest, these inland cities rose in significance, surpassing the Hellenistic cities situated nearer the coast. Alexandria was the only major Mediterranean port the Arabs continued to maintain. There, as well as in the Hellenistic cities of Syria, Christian communities remained strong, likely still outnumbering the Muslims. A similar pattern appeared in rural Syria. The inland plains and valleys increasingly embraced Islam, while the region between the Lebanon mountains and the coast remained largely Christian, with various sects present. In Egypt, the religious divide took a different form. The rural population, or fellahin, gradually converted to Islam, whereas the urban centers stayed predominantly Christian. In Palestine, religious distribution was less consistent. Much of the countryside became Muslim, but numerous villages continued practicing Christianity. Important Christian towns, such as Nazareth and Bethlehem, remained almost entirely Christian, and in Jerusalem Christians still made up the majority. Most Palestinian Christians belonged to the Orthodox millet. In addition to them, there were also significant Jewish communities in Jerusalem and in smaller towns like Safed and Tiberias. Ramla, the newly established administrative capital, became the chief Muslim center. This general demographic arrangement in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt persisted for the next 4 centuries. Muawiyah, the 5th caliph from the Umayyad dynasty, had formerly served as governor of Syria. After becoming caliph in 660 CE, he established Damascus as his capital, where his descendants would rule for nearly 100 years. This period marked an era of prosperity for Syria and Palestine. The Umayyad caliphs, with only a few exceptions, were notable for their competence and relatively broad-minded tolerance. With the caliph's court based in the region, good governance was ensured, commerce flourished, and local culture was actively supported. The culture they found and fostered was primarily Hellenistic Christian, shaped by influences commonly associated with Byzantium. Greek-speaking Christians held positions in the civil administration, and for many years, government records were kept in Greek. Christian artists and craftsmen were employed by the caliphs. A prominent architectural achievement from this period is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, completed under Caliph Abdul Malik in 691. It stands as the most distinguished example of the rotunda style from Byzantine architecture. The mosaics adorning it rank among the finest works of Byzantine art. Debate remains as to whether these mosaics were created entirely by local artisans or with assistance from craftsmen and materials brought in from Byzantium by Walid. The mosaics were designed in strict accordance with Islamic rules forbidding the depiction of living beings. However, in their private countryside retreats, such as the desert hunting lodge of Qasr al-Amra beyond the Jordan, the Umayyads allowed frescoes featuring human figures, including nude forms. In essence, their reign did not halt the development of the Near East Hellenistic cultural tradition. Instead, it supported its last and most refined expression before it faded away. For a time, Christians had little reason to resent the rise of Islam. Apart from occasional episodes of persecution and some degrading restrictions, they generally fared better under Muslim rule than they had under the Christian emperors. Law and order were more consistently maintained, commerce thrived, and taxes were significantly lighter. Furthermore, for much of the 8th century, the reigning Christian emperor was an iconoclast. In such a context, devout believers often found greater religious freedom and peace under Muslim rulers. However, this favorable period did not last. The decline of the Umayyad dynasty and the internal conflicts that eventually brought the Abbasids to power in Baghdad in 750 plunged Syria and Palestine into disorder. Local governors, driven by greed and lacking oversight, seized Christian churches and forced congregations to buy them back. Periods of religious fanaticism followed, with waves of persecution and coerced conversions. Although Abbasid rule eventually restored order, a significant shift had occurred. The relocation of the capital to distant Baghdad weakened central control over the provinces. While caravan trade remained active, the absence of a major nearby market reduced economic vitality in the region. The Abbasids, unlike their Umayyad predecessors, adhered more strictly to Islamic principles and were generally less tolerant of Christian subjects. Although they too relied on older cultural traditions, these were rooted in Persian, not Hellenistic, heritage. The Abbasid capital stood in what had once been Sassanid territory, and Persians came to dominate many positions of power. Persian styles influenced both artistic expression and everyday life at the court. As under the Umayyads, Christians were still employed in administrative roles. But now they were mostly Nestorians, whose cultural and theological orientation leaned eastward rather than westward. The Abbasids showed a keen interest in intellectual pursuits, often greater than that of the Umayyads. Nestorian scholars played a key role in translating Greek philosophical and scientific texts, and even scholars from Byzantium were invited to teach in Baghdad. Nonetheless, this engagement with Greek knowledge was relatively shallow. The core of Abbasid civilization remained grounded in the traditions of Mesopotamia and Iran. The only place in the Islamic world where Hellenistic culture truly survived was in Muslim Spain, where the exiled Umayyads had taken refuge. Despite these changes, Christians under Abbasid rule were not without comfort. Muslim writers like Al-Jaiz in the 9th century sometimes attacked them harshly, but primarily because of their wealth, confidence, and occasional disregard for legal restrictions placed upon them. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, writing to the Patriarch of Constantinople around the same time, remarked that the Muslim rulers are just and do us no wrong, nor show us any violence. This sense of fairness and self-restraint was often genuine. In the 10th century, for example, when Arab forces were struggling in their wars against Byzantium and Christian communities were attacked by angry mobs for allegedly supporting the enemy, the Caliph would ensure reparations were made for the losses they suffered. His actions were likely motivated in part by the resurgence of Byzantine power, especially as the Christian emperor now governed Muslim subjects of his own. The Orthodox churches, backed by foreign influence, continued to enjoy a relatively privileged status. In the early 10th century, the Nestorian leader Abraham III, during a dispute with the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch, told the Grand Vizier that we Nestorians are loyal friends of the Arabs and pray for their victories, emphasizing that they had no allegiance to any foreign king, unlike the Greeks, whose rulers were in constant conflict with the Arabs. Nonetheless, it was a gift of 2,000 gold coins, more than any argument, that ultimately secured his victory in the dispute. The only Christian group consistently subjected to hostility were those of pure Arab descent. Those among them who refused to convert to Islam were forced to flee across the border and seek asylum in the Byzantine Empire. Christian migration into territories controlled by the Byzantine Emperor remained steady, and Muslim authorities did not attempt to stop it. There was never a consistent effort to prevent Christians inside and outside the caliphate from maintaining close ties, even during times of war. Throughout much of the Abbasid era, the Byzantine emperor lacked the strength to offer meaningful support to his fellow Christians. The failed Arab siege of Constantinople in 718 secured the survival of the Byzantine Empire, but it would take another 2 centuries before Byzantium could seriously counterattack the Arabs. Meanwhile, Eastern Orthodox Christians found a new ally in the emerging Carolingian Empire during the 8th century. As Charlemagne began expressing concern for the Christian holy sites, his involvement was warmly welcomed. The Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, eager to gain an ally against Byzantium, encouraged Charlemagne's efforts to establish religious institutions in Jerusalem and to send charitable gifts to the churches there. For a time, Charlemagne was seen as the protector of Orthodox Christians in Palestine, taking over a role once held by the Byzantine emperor. In gratitude, local Christians honored him with gifts and signs of respect. However, this support faded as Charlemagne's empire crumbled under his heirs and the Byzantine Empire experienced a revival. Frankish involvement in the region quickly diminished and was largely forgotten, apart from a few lingering traces, such as the Gusthouses Charlemagne had established, the Latin services held in the Church of St. Mary of the Latins, and the Latin nuns who served at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Still, in Western Europe, the memory of this episode endured. Over time, stories and legends inflated Charlemagne's role, with claims that he had established legal rights over the holy places or had even made a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. For future generations of Franks, their claim to authority in Jerusalem seemed both legitimate and divinely endorsed. Eastern Christians, however, were more concerned with the resurgence of Byzantine strength. In the early 9th century, the empire remained largely defensive, having lost territories like Sicily and Crete to Muslim forces. Arab raids into the heart of Asia Minor were a regular occurrence. By the middle of the century, thanks to the prudent fiscal policies of Empress Theodora, the Byzantine navy was restored and rearmed, allowing the empire to reclaim control over southern Italy and Dalmatia. In the early 10th century, the Abbasid Caliphate began to collapse rapidly. Regional powers, such as the Hamdanids in Mosul and Aleppo, and the Ikhshidids in Egypt emerged. The Hamdanids were skilled warriors and devout Muslims, briefly acting as a barrier to Byzantine expansion. However, their involvement in internal conflicts only hastened the decline of Muslim power. Amid these struggles, the Ikhshidids took control of Palestine and southern Syria, creating an opening the Byzantines quickly exploited. Initially cautious, Byzantine advances soon accelerated. By 945, despite the military efforts of the Hamdanid ruler Sef al-Dawla, the Byzantine general John Kirkuas had recaptured territories in Upper Mesopotamia that had not seen a Christian army in over 300 years. Progress quickened after 960 when the renowned General Nicephorus Phocas assumed command of the imperial forces. In 961, he recaptured Crete. A year later, he launched a campaign on the Cilician frontier, capturing Anazarbus and Marash, Germanisha, effectively isolating Muslim-held Cilicia. In 963, Nicephorus focused on domestic matters, orchestrating a successful coup that brought him to the throne. Returning east in 964, he completed the conquest of Cilicia and dispatched a force to Cyprus, reasserting full Byzantine control over the island. In 966, he led a campaign along the Middle Euphrates to disrupt communication between Aleppo and Mosul. These victories stirred hope throughout the Christian East. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, John, sent a letter urging Nicephorus to advance into Palestine. However, this act of perceived betrayal enraged the Muslim population. In response, John was arrested and publicly executed by burning at the stake. John's optimism proved to be premature. During 967 and 968, Nicephorus was occupied with affairs along the empire's northern frontier. However, in 969, he led his forces southward into the core of Syria. Advancing through the Orontes Valley, he captured and plundered the major cities of Shazer, Hama, and Homs, eventually reaching the outskirts of Tripoli on the coast. As he made his way back north, he left behind a trail of destruction, setting fire to Tortosa, Jabala, and Laodike, while his commanders laid siege to Antioch and Aleppo. The historic city of Antioch fell in October, and Aleppo capitulated by the end of the year. In Antioch, where Christians likely outnumbered Muslims, the city was fully integrated into the Byzantine Empire. It appears that the Muslim population was forced to leave the area. Aleppo, predominantly Muslim, was turned into a vassal state. The treaty with its ruler clearly marked the boundary between the new imperial territory and the tributary cities. The ruler of Aleppo would henceforth be appointed by the Byzantine emperor. The state was required to pay significant taxes directly to the imperial treasury, from which Christians were exempt. Imperial merchants and trade caravans were granted special rights and protections. These humiliating terms seemed to signal the nearing collapse of Muslim control in Syria. Before Aleppo surrendered, the Emperor Nicephorus was assassinated in Constantinople by his wife and her lover, his cousin John Tzimiskes. Despite his military successes, Nicephorus was a stern and unpopular figure, disliked for his harsh taxation, corruption, and conflicts with the church. John, already renowned as a skilled general, had no trouble ascending to the throne. He reconciled with the church by distancing himself from his imperial mistress. However, a war with Bulgaria kept him occupied in Europe for the next 4 years. During this time, Islam experienced a resurgence under the Fatimid dynasty, which gained control over Egypt and southern Syria and even attempted to retake Antioch in 971. By 974, John was finally able to focus on the Eastern Front. That autumn, he launched a campaign into eastern Mesopotamia, capturing Nisibin and subduing Mosul, even briefly considering a bold march toward Baghdad. Yet he recognized that the Fatimids posed a greater threat than the Abbasids, and in the spring he redirected his efforts toward Syria. Following the same path that Nicephorus had taken 6 years earlier, John advanced through the Orontes Valley. Homs surrendered without resistance. Baalbek was taken by force, and Damascus offered tribute and pledged allegiance. Continuing into Galilee, he reached Tiberias and Nazareth before descending to the coast at Caesarea. Delegates from Jerusalem approached him, pleading for mercy to avoid a brutal sack. However, with many key Phoenician coastal cities still under enemy control behind him, John decided not to press onward to the Holy City. Instead, he moved northward, capturing coastal towns one by one, with the exception of the heavily fortified port of Tripoli. As winter approached, the emperor had no choice but to suspend his campaign. On his return to Antioch, he secured and garrisoned the important mountain fortresses of Barzia and Sion in the Nozeri range. He then made his way back to Constantinople, but the campaign was never resumed. In January 976, he died suddenly. These conflicts had re-established the Christian empire as a dominant force in the East. With the liberation of Eastern Christians appearing within reach, these wars began to take on the character of religious crusades. Previously, battles against Muslims were largely considered routine defensive actions for the protection of the empire and were regarded as part of everyday life. Occasionally, Christian prisoners might be forced by zealous Muslim victors to choose between renouncing their faith or facing death, and their martyrdoms were respectfully commemorated. In the eyes of the Byzantine public, dying in battle against Muslim forces carried no more spiritual merit than falling in combat against fellow Christians like the Bulgars. The church made no distinction between the two. However, both Nicephorus and John declared that the conflict had now become a holy cause, for the honor of Christendom, for the redemption of the sacred sites, and for the downfall of Islam. Already during imperial celebrations of victories over the Saracens, hymns were sung praising God for triumphing over them. Nicephorus was particularly vocal about presenting his military campaigns as Christian missions, possibly in an attempt to offset his poor relationship with the church. He tried to persuade the patriarch to endorse a decree declaring soldiers who perished on the Eastern Front as martyrs. But the Eastern Church, firm in its beliefs, would not condone killing as an acceptable path to sainthood. Still, in the inflammatory message he sent to the caliph before launching his 964 campaign, Nicephorus portrayed himself as a defender of Christianity and even threatened to march to Mecca to establish Christ's throne there. John Tzimiskes adopted similar rhetoric. In a letter recounting his 974 campaign to the Armenian king, he expressed a desire to liberate the Holy Sepulchre from Muslim desecration. He explained that he had spared the cities of Galilee from being looted due to their significance in Christian history. Reflecting on his inability to take Tripoli, he added that, had it not been for that setback, he would have continued on to Jerusalem to worship at its holy sites. Muslims, who had traditionally been more inclined to see warfare through a religious lens, had grown complacent. Alarmed by the Christian resurgence, they sought to reignite their own religious zeal. In 974, riots in Baghdad compelled the caliph to declare a jihad, a holy war. It had appeared that the Holy Land might finally return to Christian rule. But the Orthodox Christians of Palestine would be disappointed. John's successor, Basil II, never had the chance to resume the southern campaigns. His reign was dominated by internal strife and a prolonged war with the Bulgarians, which demanded his full attention. Basil managed to visit Syria only twice. In 995, he reaffirmed Byzantine authority over Aleppo, and in 999, he led an expedition as far south as Tripoli. By 1001, he concluded that further expansion in the region would be futile. A 10-year truce was negotiated with the Fatimid Caliph, initiating a peace that would remain mostly undisturbed for more than 50 years. The frontier between the two empires was established, running from the Mediterranean coast between Banyas and Tortosa to the Orontes River just south of Caesarea Shazer. Though Aleppo remained nominally under Byzantine influence, the rise of the Murtisite dynasty in 1023 brought de facto independence. In 1030, the emir of Aleppo decisively defeated a Byzantine force. However, this loss was offset the following year when Edessa was successfully incorporated into the Byzantine Empire. The peace agreement was mutually beneficial for both the Byzantine Empire and the Fatimid Caliphate, as both powers were alarmed by the resurgence of the Abbasid Caliphate, now bolstered by Turkish adventurers from Central Asia. The Fatimid ruler, recognized by the Shia Muslims as the rightful caliph, could not risk a renewed assertion of Abbasid authority. Meanwhile, Byzantium regarded its eastern frontier as more vulnerable than the southern one. This fear of Turkish incursions prompted Basil II to annex the nearby Armenian provinces and eventually absorb the southeastern principality of Vaspurakan. His successors continued this strategy, and in 1045, the king of Ani, the primary Armenian ruler, surrendered his kingdom to the empire. The last remaining independent Armenian territory, the Principality of Kars, was integrated into the empire in 1064. The motivation behind these annexations was largely strategic. Past experience had shown that the Armenian nobility could not be trusted. Despite their shared Christian faith and mutual opposition to Muslim conquest, the Armenians were deemed heretics by Orthodox standards and often harbored greater animosity toward Byzantium than toward Muslim powers. Although cultural exchange and trade flourished, and many Armenians rose to prominence within the Byzantine administration, deep-rooted hostility persisted. Given Armenia's geographic position, it provided a direct route into Asia Minor. It would have been unwise for Byzantine military planners to leave such a vulnerable area beyond their control. However, from a political standpoint, the decision was less prudent. The Armenians deeply resented imperial rule. Though Byzantine troops guarded the frontiers, the internal population remained dissatisfied and potentially disloyal. Without their traditional local leadership, many Armenians became rootless and contributed to growing unrest within the empire. More far-sighted leaders might have avoided triggering the Armenian question, which introduced a disruptive and discontented minority into the empire's social fabric. While northern Syria had come under Christian rule, the Christians living in southern Syria and Palestine generally tolerated Fatimid governance. They experienced only one brief period of persecution under Caliph Hakim. Ironically, Hakim was the son of a Christian mother and had been largely raised under Christian influence. Yet around 1004, he turned sharply against his early upbringing. For the next decade, despite Byzantine protests, he issued harsh edicts targeting Christians. In 1009, He ordered the demolition of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, declaring that the annual miracle of the Holy Fire, celebrated there on Easter Eve, was nothing more than a deceitful illusion. By 1014, approximately 30,000 churches have been burned or looted, and many Christians, fearing for their lives, outwardly converted to Islam. The Jewish population also suffered similar treatment. However, it's important to note that Muslims were equally subject to the caliph's unpredictable persecution. Despite his oppressive measures, Hakim continued to employ Christian officials. In 1013, perhaps to appease the emperor, he permitted Christians to emigrate into Byzantine territory. The persecution ended when Hakim began to believe he was divine. In 1016, this claim was publicly affirmed by his associate Durazi. Muslim outrage over this blasphemy far exceeded any previous Christian or Jewish distress. Hakim, now alienating Muslims, banned the Ramadan fast and the pilgrimage to Mecca while offering greater freedoms to Christians and Jews. In 1017, full religious freedom was restored. Around 6,000 of the recently converted Christians returned to their faith. In 1020, churches had their properties returned, including materials taken during their destruction, and the rule requiring distinctive clothing for Christians and Jews was abolished. Yet by this time, Muslim resentment against Hakim had reached its peak. Durazi fled to Lebanon and founded the religious sect later known as the Druze, named after him. As for Hakim, he vanished in 1021, likely assassinated by his ambitious sister, Sid al-Mulk. His disappearance remains a mystery to this day. The Druze continue to believe that he will one day return. Following his death, control of Palestine briefly passed to Salih ibn Mirdas, the emir of Aleppo. However, by 1029, Fatimid rule had been fully re-established. As early as 1027, a treaty had been signed that granted Emperor Constantine VIII permission to oversee the restoration of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This agreement also allowed former apostates to return to Christianity without facing punishment. The treaty was renewed in 1036, though the actual reconstruction of the church was not undertaken until nearly a decade later, during the reign of Emperor Constantine IX. Imperial officials traveled freely to Jerusalem to supervise the project. Their presence was so prominent that it stirred resentment among Muslim residents and visitors, who felt that Christians had effectively taken over the city. The number of Byzantines in Jerusalem's streets led to widespread rumors among Muslims that the emperor himself had arrived. Meanwhile, a thriving colony of Amalfitane merchants operated in the city under the caliph's protection. These merchants declared their allegiance to the emperor in hopes of securing the benefits extended to his subjects. The strength of the Byzantine Empire served as a shield for local Christians. In 1047, the Persian traveler Nasirai Khusro recorded seeing many Greek merchant ships docked in Tripoli's harbor and noted the local population's anxiety over a possible attack from the Byzantine navy. By the mid-11th century, Christians in Palestine were enjoying a period of relative prosperity and peace. Muslim authorities exercised a tolerant approach, and the Byzantine emperor remained attentive to their welfare. Trade between Palestine and Christian nations overseas flourished, and Jerusalem benefited immensely from the sympathy, wealth, and increasing number of pilgrims arriving from the West. The longing to go on a pilgrimage is deeply embedded in human nature. Standing in the places once walked by those we hold in reverence, seeing the very locations where they were born, lived, and died, offers us a sense of mystical connection and serves as a tangible tribute to their memory. If the great figures of history have sacred sites where admirers travel from afar to pay homage, then how much more eagerly do people journey to places believed to have been touched by the divine? In the earliest days of Christianity, pilgrimages were uncommon. Early Christian belief focused more on the divinity and universal presence of Christ than on his human life, and the Roman authorities were not inclined to support travel to Palestine. Jerusalem, destroyed by Titus, lay in ruins until it was rebuilt by Hadrian as the Roman city of Aelia. Yet, Christians never forgot the sacred landscape where Christ's life unfolded. Their deep respect for the site of Calvary was so well known that Hadrian intentionally built a temple to Venus Capitolina on that very spot. By the 3rd century, the cave at Bethlehem was already familiar to many Christians. Devotees also traveled to the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, and the site of the Ascension. Visiting these sacred locations for prayer and spiritual reward had already become a part of Christian devotion. As Christianity gained prominence, pilgrimages became more common. Emperor Constantine, in embracing the faith, supported its expansion. His mother, Empress Helena, embarked on a journey to Palestine to uncover Calvary and locate relics from the Passion of Christ. Her discoveries were honored by Constantine, who commissioned the construction of a church on the site. That church, despite centuries of change, remains the central shrine of Christianity, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Pilgrims quickly began traveling to the places Helena had explored. While many left no records of their journeys, we know that by the year 333, even before the completion of Helena's excavations, a traveler from Bordeaux made his way to Palestine and documented his trip. Soon after, a determined woman recorded her pilgrimage through the Holy Land. Toward the end of the 4th century, one of the great Latin Church fathers, Saint Jerome, settled in Palestine, drawing with him a group of wealthy and noble women who had once studied under him in Italy. From his cell in Bethlehem, he welcomed a steady stream of visitors who came to honor him after visiting the sacred sites. St. Augustine, one of the most spiritually profound Western fathers, viewed pilgrimages as unnecessary or even harmful. Many of the Eastern Greek fathers shared this opinion. St. Jerome, however, while not claiming that living in Jerusalem held any spiritual benefit, argued that praying where Christ once stood was an act of faith. His perspective proved more appealing to the broader public than Augustine's. As a result, pilgrimages increased, receiving encouragement from church and imperial authorities alike. By the early 5th century, it was said that Jerusalem and its surroundings hosted as many as 200 monasteries and guest houses built to accommodate pilgrims. By the middle of the 5th century, the early enthusiasm for Jerusalem reached its peak. Empress Eudocia, daughter of a pagan philosopher from Athens, chose to settle in Jerusalem after a troubled life at the imperial court. Accompanied by devout members of the Byzantine aristocracy, she immersed herself in religious pursuits. Between composing hymns, she became an active supporter of the growing trend of relic collection. She helped lay the foundation for Constantinople's famed relic collection by sending there what was believed to be a portrait of the Virgin Mary, painted by St. Luke. Her actions inspired not only pilgrims from Constantinople, but also from the West. For centuries, the luxuries of the material world had flowed from the East. Now, religious treasures began to follow the same path. Christianity had its roots in the East, and most of the early saints and martyrs came from that region. As devotion to saints became more widespread, influential voices like Prudentius and Ennodius preached that divine help could be found at saints' tombs, and that their remains were capable of working miracles. People began to travel great distances to see sacred relics. The most important relics remained in the East. Those of Christ stayed in Jerusalem until later moved to Constantinople, while most saints' relics stayed near their original homelands. Still, lesser relics gradually made their way to the West. Eventually, even small fragments of major relics were transported westward, followed by entire major relics themselves. This religious movement further drew the West's attention to the East. The people of Langres, proud owners of a finger of St. Mamas, were naturally drawn to visit his hometown of Caesarea in Cappadocia. The nuns at Chamaliers, who possessed the bones of St. Thecla, became personally invested in her birthplace at Isaurian Seleucia. When a woman from Orient returned from her journey with the thumb of St. John the Baptist, her peers were inspired to visit his body in Samaria and his head in Damascus. Entire diplomatic missions were sometimes dispatched in hopes of acquiring such treasures. Churches in the West were increasingly named after Eastern saints or sacred places like the Holy Sepulchre, and often a portion of their income was dedicated to supporting the original holy sites from which their names were drawn. This connection between East and West was supported by ongoing Mediterranean trade. Though commerce was gradually declining due to the economic weakening of the West and disruptions like the Vandal piracy that made sea travel dangerous, contact was still maintained. Religious divisions and unrest in the East also presented obstacles. Nevertheless, in the 6th century, many Western pilgrims continued to journey eastward aboard Greek or Syrian merchant vessels. These traders not only transported goods and passengers, but also carried religious stories and updates. Because of such exchanges, Western chroniclers like Gregory of Tours remained well informed about events in the East. One record even tells of a conversation between Saint Simeon Stylites and a Syrian merchant. In this exchange, Saint Simeon inquired about Saint Genevieve of Paris and sent her a personal greeting. Despite theological disputes and political tensions among church leaders, the relationship between Eastern and Western Christians during this time remained strong and full of goodwill. The period of early pilgrimages came to a close with the Arab conquests. Syrian merchants stopped visiting the coasts of France and Italy, bringing with them goods and news. Piracy once again became a threat in the Mediterranean, and the Muslim rulers of Palestine viewed Christian travelers with suspicion. The journey grew both costly and dangerous, and the Western Christian world had little wealth to spare. Still, contact was not completely severed. Christians in the West continued to feel a deep emotional and spiritual connection to the sacred sites of the East. In 682, when Pope Martin I was accused of maintaining friendly relations with Muslims, he justified his actions by saying he sought permission to send charitable donations to Jerusalem. In 670, a Frankish bishop named Arculf embarked on a pilgrimage to the East, successfully touring Egypt, Syria, and Palestine before returning via Constantinople. The entire journey took several years and was filled with hardship. We also know of other pilgrims from this period, such as Wulfi of Rouen in Picardy and Bercaire of Monturandre in Burgundy, along with his companion Wymer. Their accounts reveal that only determined and rugged men were capable of making the pilgrimage to Jerusalem at that time. Women did not appear to attempt such journeys. The number of pilgrims began to rise during the 8th century. Some even traveled from England. In his youth, Willibald made a pilgrimage to Palestine, setting out from Rome in 722 and returning only after several difficult years in 729. By the end of the century, there seems to have been an effort to organize pilgrimages under the sponsorship of Charlemagne. He had restored order and relative prosperity to the West and established diplomatic ties with the Caliph Harun al-Rashid. The hostels built with his support in the Holy Land suggest that many pilgrims visited Jerusalem during his reign, including women. Nuns from Christian Spain were even sent to serve at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. However, this wave of pilgrimage was short-lived. The Carolingian Empire declined, and Muslim pirates re-emerged in the eastern Mediterranean, while Norse raiders attacked from the west. When Bernard the Wise of Brittany visited Palestine in 870, he found the facilities built under Charlemagne still standing but empty and falling into ruin. He had only been able to travel by securing a passport from the Muslim rulers of Bari in southern Italy. The Golden Age of pilgrimage began in the 10th century. Over time, Arab pirates were expelled from their strongholds in Italy and southern France, and in 961, Crete was retaken from them. The Byzantine navy had already begun to assert its control over the seas, reviving maritime commerce across the Mediterranean. Greek and Italian merchant ships moved freely between ports in Italy and the Byzantine Empire and, with the cooperation of Muslim authorities, began to open trade routes to Syria and Egypt. Pilgrims could now more easily secure passage directly from cities like Venice or Bari to Tripoli or Alexandria. Still, many chose to stop first in Constantinople to view its renowned relics before continuing their journey, either by sea or overland. In Palestine, the Muslim rulers generally did not obstruct Christian travelers. On the contrary, they welcomed them, recognizing the economic benefits the pilgrims brought to the region. The improved conditions for pilgrimage had a noticeable impact on religious thinking in the West. It is uncertain when pilgrimages were first mandated as formal penance. Early medieval penitential texts recommended pilgrimages, though they rarely specified particular destinations. However, there was a growing belief that certain holy sites possessed unique spiritual power. For the pilgrim, these journeys offered not only the chance to venerate the physical relics and surroundings associated with God and His saints, fostering a mystical connection, but also the hope of receiving God's forgiveness. From the 10th century onward, pilgrimage destinations were considered especially powerful in this regard. The shrine of St. James at Compostela in Spain, that of St. Michael at Monte Gargano in Italy, the many sacred locations in Rome, and, above all, the holy sites in Palestine. These places were now far more accessible, either due to Muslim retreat or their cooperation. Yet the journey remained long and challenging. Sending a criminal away on a pilgrimage for a year or more distanced him from his crime, and the physical hardship and costs served as a form of penance. The spiritual rewards and the sacred atmosphere at the journey's end provided emotional renewal. He returned transformed. Chroniclers often make passing references to frequent pilgrimages, although the names that survive tend to be those of prominent figures. Among the high-ranking pilgrims were Hilda, Countess of Swabia, who died on her journey in 969, and Judith, Duchess of Bavaria and sister-in-law to Emperor Otto I, who made her pilgrimage in 970. Other noble pilgrims included the Counts of Ardèche, Vienne, Verdun, Arcy, Anhalt, and Gorizia. Senior church figures were even more committed. Saint Conrad, Bishop of Constance, journeyed to Jerusalem 3 times, while Saint John, Bishop of Parma, went there 6 times. The Bishop of Olivola visited in 920. Several abbots made the trip as well. These well-known pilgrims were often accompanied by groups of humble men and women whose names went unrecorded. Most of this activity stemmed from personal initiative. However, a new political and religious force was emerging in Europe. In 910, Count William I of Aquitaine founded the Abbey of Cluny. By the end of the century, Cluny had become the heart of a vast and orderly monastic network, closely aligned with the papacy. The Cluniac movement saw itself as the moral guardian of Western Christendom. Pilgrimage, in their view, was a practice worth supporting. They sought to make it more accessible and better organized. By the early 11th century, Cluny had assumed near total control over the pilgrimages to the major shrines in Spain. At the same time, they began to encourage and promote pilgrimages to Jerusalem. It was at their urging that the abbot of Stavelot traveled to the Holy Land in 990, followed by the Count of Verdun in 997. Cluny's growing influence is reflected in the large number of 11th century pilgrims from France and Lorraine. While there were still many German pilgrims, including the archbishops of Trier and Mainz and the Bishop of Bamberg, and a steady stream of English pilgrims, those from France and Lorraine became dominant. The 2 powerful dynasties of northern France were both close allies of Cluny, despite their rivalry. Both supported journeys to the east. Fulk Nerra, the fierce Count of Anjou, went to Jerusalem in 1002 and returned twice more. Duke Richard III of Normandy sent charitable gifts to the Holy Land, while Duke Robert personally led a massive pilgrimage there in 1035. These events were all faithfully recorded by the Cluniac historian, the monk Glaber. The Normans eagerly followed the example set by their dukes. They held a deep reverence for Saint Michael, and large numbers of them undertook pilgrimages to Monte Gargano. From there, the more adventurous among them would continue their journey to Palestine. By the middle of the 11th century, they made up such a significant and passionate portion of the pilgrims traveling to Palestine that the authorities in Constantinople, upset by Norman incursions into Byzantine territory in Italy, began to treat the pilgrim movement with suspicion. Their Scandinavian relatives displayed a similar fervor. Scandinavians had long visited Constantinople and were captivated by its riches and splendor. Back home, they spoke of the city with awe, even equating it at times with Asgard, the mythical home of the gods. By 930, Norse warriors were already serving in the emperor's army. Early in the 11th century, their numbers had grown large enough to form the renowned Varangian Guard. Many of these Varangians developed the custom of journeying to Jerusalem during their leave. The earliest known instance was a man named Kolskegr, who was in Palestine in 992. Harold Hardrada, the most celebrated of the Varangians, made his pilgrimage in 1034. Throughout the 11th century, numerous Norwegians, Icelanders, and Danes spent years in imperial service, then made pilgrimages to Jerusalem before returning home, enriched by their savings. Inspired by their stories, friends and relatives often traveled south solely for the pilgrimage. Thorvald Kudranson Vidforli, known as the Apostle of Iceland, visited Jerusalem around 990. Some Norse pilgrims even claimed to have seen Olaf Tryggvason, Norway's first Christian king, in Jerusalem following his mysterious disappearance in 1000. Olaf, too, intended to follow in his predecessor's footsteps, but his journey remained only a legend. Many of these Nordic nobles were men of violence, often guilty of murder and in search of spiritual atonement. Sweyn Godwinson, who was half Danish, led a group of Englishmen to Jerusalem in 1051 as penance for a killing. He died of exposure in the Anatolian mountains the following autumn, having made the journey barefoot as a sign of repentance. Lagman Gudrodsson, the Norse king of Man, who had murdered his brother, also sought God's forgiveness through pilgrimage. A typical route favored by Scandinavian pilgrims was a circuitous one. In the 10th century, pilgrims from the west were primarily forced to journey by sea across the Mediterranean to reach Constantinople or Syria. However, sea travel was expensive and available space was limited. In 975, the rulers of Hungary embraced Christianity, opening up an overland route that followed the Danube and crossed the Balkans into Constantinople. This path remained perilous until 1019, when the Byzantine Empire secured control over the entire Balkan region. After that, pilgrims could travel safely through Hungary, enter the Byzantine Empire at Belgrade, and continue through Sofia and Adrianople to the imperial capital. Another option was to travel to Byzantine-controlled southern Italy, then take the short sea crossing from Bari to Dyrrhachium, and follow the ancient Roman via Egnatia through Thessalonica to the Bosphorus. From there, 3 well-established roads led across Asia Minor to Antioch. The route continued down to the coast at Latakia and into Fatimid territory near Tortosa. This was the only border pilgrims had to cross after arriving at Belgrade or Tamoli, and from that point, they could proceed without further obstacles to Jerusalem. Although overland travel was slower than going by sea, it was far less costly and more convenient, particularly for those traveling in large groups. As long as pilgrims behaved respectfully, they could generally rely on warm hospitality from the peasants throughout the Byzantine Empire. Along the early stages of the journey, the Cluniac order had begun establishing hostels to assist travelers. In Italy, there were several hospices, some designated specifically for Norse pilgrims. A large and important hospice was located at Melk in Austria. In Constantinople, Western pilgrims were welcomed at the Hospice of Samson, and the Cluniacs also maintained a facility in Rodosto, situated in the outskirts of the city. In Jerusalem itself, accommodations were available at the Hospital of St. John, founded by merchants from Amalfi. Western nobles often traveled with armed escorts, which was acceptable provided the soldiers remained disciplined. Many pilgrims sought the safety of traveling with such groups, although journeying alone or in small numbers was not unusual, nor especially dangerous. At times, however, there were complications. During periods of persecution under Hakim, it became uncomfortable to remain in Palestine for extended periods, though the influx of pilgrims never fully ceased. In 1055, the frontier leading into Muslim-controlled territory was considered unsafe. Lietbert, the bishop of Cambrai, was denied permission to exit Lataki by the local governor and was forced to detour to Cyprus. A year later, in 1056, Muslim authorities barred Westerners from entering the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and expelled around 300 of them from Jerusalem. There were also incidents that caused offense within the Byzantine Empire. Both Emperor Basil II and his successor, Empress Theodora, incurred criticism for directing customs officials to impose taxes on pilgrims and their horses. In response, Pope Victor II wrote to the Empress in late 1056, urging her to revoke the decree. His letter implied that imperial tax collectors were even operating in Jerusalem itself. Despite these occasional setbacks, such disruptions were uncommon. Throughout most of the 11th century, until its final decades, a continuous flow of travelers headed east. These pilgrims came in groups that sometimes numbered in the thousands, ready to spend a year or more on the journey in the unhurried spirit of the time. Many would pause in Constantinople to marvel at the immense city, which dwarfed anything they had seen in the West, and to venerate the sacred relics it held. Among the treasures were the crown of thorns, the seamless garment, and many of the Passion's most revered relics. Pilgrims could behold the cloth from Edessa bearing the image of Christ's face, a portrait of the Virgin attributed to St. Luke, the hair of John the Baptist, the mantle of Elijah, and the bodies of countless saints, prophets, and martyrs. From there, the pilgrims would journey on to Palestine, visiting sacred sites such as Nazareth, Mount Tabor, the River Jordan, Bethlehem, and the numerous shrines in Jerusalem. At each stop, they prayed and paid their respects. Afterward, they undertook the long return trip, spiritually uplifted and transformed. Upon arriving home, they were honored by their communities as pilgrims of Christ who had completed the holiest of voyages. However, the pilgrimage experience relied on two essential conditions. First, there needed to be peace and stability in Palestine to ensure the safety of unarmed travelers. Second, the route to the Holy Land had to remain accessible and affordable. These requirements depended on two major factors: good governance and order in the Muslim world, and the continued prosperity and goodwill of the Byzantine Empire. By the middle of the 11th century, the Eastern Mediterranean enjoyed a period of apparent stability that seemed likely to endure. The two dominant powers in the region maintained cordial relations. Neither pursued expansionist aims, and both were keen to restrain the Muslim states further east, where Turkish adventurers were beginning to cause unrest. However, these disturbances had yet to cause real concern in either Constantinople or Cairo. The Fatimids maintained a friendly stance toward Christians. Since the death of Caliph Hakim, persecution had ceased, and Egyptian ports had been opened to merchants from Byzantium and Italy. Both traders and pilgrims benefited from this hospitable environment. This peaceful state was underpinned by the strength of the Byzantine Empire. A succession of formidable military emperors had expanded its reach from the shores of the Lebanon to the banks of the Danube, and from Naples to the Caspian Sea. Despite occasional corruption and sporadic unrest, the empire was administered more efficiently than any other kingdom of its time. Constantinople had reached an unparalleled level of prosperity. It was the world's leading center of commerce and finance. Merchants from Italy, Germany, Russia, Egypt, and the East converged upon the city to purchase its fine manufactured goods and to barter their own more rustic products. The sheer scale and liveliness of the city left visitors awestruck. Even though the imperial court was currently overseen by two eccentric elderly princesses, it remained, to outside observers, the very heart of the universe. If art reflects the soul of a civilization, then Byzantine culture was flourishing. 11th century artists upheld the classical ideals of harmony and restraint while blending in two elements from Eastern traditions: the ornate stylization of Persian art and the spiritual depth of the ancient Near East. Whether in small ivory carvings, vast mosaic compositions, or rural churches like those at Daphne or Hosios Lukis in Greece, the art of this era demonstrated a masterful fusion of diverse influences into a unified whole. The literature of the period, though somewhat constrained by the enduring influence of classical models, was remarkably varied and of high quality. Among the preserved works are the refined history of John Diaconus, the lyrical poetry of Christopher of Mytilene, the sweeping folk epic of Digenis Acritas, the pragmatic sayings of the soldier Secominus, and the sharp, satirical memoirs of Michael Sellis. The mood of the era evoked something of the self-confidence of the 18th century, though it was tinged with a spiritual detachment and a lingering pessimism that Byzantium could never fully shake. The Greek character was intricate and elusive, far more complex than the idealized portrayals offered by popular interpreters of the 5th century BC. The Byzantine Greek, shaped further by the influence of Eastern ancestry, exhibited even greater contradictions. He was remarkably pragmatic, adept in commerce, and drawn to worldly honors. Yet he was equally inclined to abandon secular life in pursuit of monastic solitude. He held a deep belief in the divine mission of the empire and the sacred authority of the emperor, while at the same time displaying a fiercely independent spirit, quick to challenge a government that displeased him. Though he viewed heresy with deep suspicion, his religion allowed significant philosophical freedom to both clergy and laity. He considered his neighbors to be uncultured barbarians, yet he readily adopted their customs and ideas. For all his refinement and pride, he often lacked emotional steadiness. Byzantium had narrowly escaped catastrophe many times, eroding his trust and stability. In moments of sudden crisis, he could succumb to panic and commit acts of cruelty that would have appalled him in calmer times. Even during periods of peace and prosperity, he remained haunted by countless prophecies predicting the fall of his city. For him, lasting peace and happiness were not to be found in this fleeting world, but only in the eternal kingdom of heaven. These fears were not unfounded. The foundations of Byzantine strength were never entirely secure. The empire's structure was fundamentally defensive. Its provinces were administered by military governors, who were themselves supervised by the civil bureaucracy in Constantinople. This arrangement produced an effective local militia capable of protecting regional territories during invasions and supporting the central army in major campaigns. However, in times of peace, it conferred excessive authority on provincial governors. Moreover, the empire's growing affluence was undermining the agrarian system in Asia Minor. Byzantium had long relied on communities of freeholding peasants, who often exchanged military service for land granted directly by the state. But, as throughout the medieval world, land was the most secure form of wealth. The wealthy sought to expand their estates, and the church encouraged devout followers to donate land. Land was also a common reward for military leaders and high-ranking officials. While the expansion of the empire or the repopulation of ravaged regions had temporarily concealed the dangers, prosperity itself fueled an insatiable demand for land. Nobles and monasteries increasingly acquired property by purchasing plots from peasants in need of money or by assuming control over entire villages. More prudent emperors attempted to curb this trend, knowing that large landowners often prioritized profits from sheep farming over crop cultivation and that the loss of peasant soldiers' land to aristocrats weakened the state's military capacity while enabling magnates to raise their own private forces. Yet these laws ultimately failed. By the 10th century, a powerful, land-owning hereditary aristocracy had taken shape in Byzantium, with enough influence and wealth to challenge imperial authority. Emperor Basil II, one of the most formidable rulers of the Macedonian dynasty, faced and overcame a rebellion by this aristocracy early in his reign. His victory secured his prestige, which endured until the dynasty's end in 1056, upon the death of his niece, Empress Theodora. Had the Macedonian line produced male heirs, it is likely the imperial throne would have passed through hereditary succession, giving the state a stronger mechanism for containing aristocratic power. Nonetheless, dynastic loyalty allowed Empress Zoe and her various husbands to govern with careless extravagance for nearly 3 decades, and later enabled the elderly Theodora to rule alone. Yet beneath this surface stability, internal divisions intensified. Upon Theodora's death, the empire stood divided between 2 opposing factions: the court elite, which managed the central administration, and the aristocratic families who dominated the military. Meanwhile, the church, with allegiances in both camps, attempted to mediate and maintain a precarious balance of power. Barely had the 70-year-old empress slipped into her final coma when the court moved swiftly to place an elderly bureaucrat, Michael Stratioticus, on the throne. However, the army refused to recognize him. Marching on Constantinople with clear intentions, the soldiers demanded their commander be crowned. Michael abdicated without resistance, and General Isaac Comnenus was proclaimed emperor. The military aristocracy had claimed its first victory. Isaac Comnenus, like many of the Byzantine nobility, was only a second-generation aristocrat. His father, a soldier from Thrace, had caught the attention of Basil II, who rewarded him with lands in Paphlagonia. There he built a fortress known as Castra Comnenion, still referred to today as Kastamuni. Isaac and his brother John inherited their father's estate and martial skills, and both strengthened their social positions by marrying into established aristocratic families. Isaac wed a Bulgarian princess from the former royal house, while John married an heiress for the powerful Dalasinos family. Despite his wealth, authority, and military backing, Isaac's rule was constantly obstructed by the entrenched hostility of the civil bureaucracy. After 2 years of mounting frustration, he renounced power and entered a monastery. With no son to inherit the throne, he named Constantine Ducas as his successor. Constantine Ducas came from one of the oldest and wealthiest aristocratic families in Byzantium. However, his rise to prominence had occurred within the imperial court rather than on the battlefield. Isaac had hoped that Constantine would bridge the divide between the military and the bureaucracy. Yet Constantine quickly revealed his preference for the latter. Confronted with an empty treasury and a politically dominant army, he chose to reduce the size of the armed forces. While this may have been reasonable as a domestic policy, it was dangerously short-sighted in a realm where military strength was essential. At no point in Byzantine history could a weakening of the empire's defense be considered safe. Trouble was brewing in the east, while conflict in the west had already erupted. For years, southern Italy had been a region of instability and confusion. Although the Byzantine Empire's frontier officially stretched from Terracina on the Tyrrhenian Sea to Tumoli on the Adriatic, only the provinces of Apulia and Calabria were directly governed by Constantinople. These areas were predominantly Greek in population. Along the western coast, the 3 maritime republics remained nominal vassals of the emperor. Among them, Amalfi maintained an active trade with the Muslim East and valued the emperor's favor in dealings with the Fatimid rulers. They even kept a permanent consul in Constantinople. Meanwhile, Naples and Gaeta, though equally engaged in trade with Muslim merchants, were less deferential toward the Byzantine throne. Inland, the region was controlled by the Lombard princes of Benevento and Salerno, who alternated their allegiance between the Eastern and Western empires, while showing little respect to either. Sicily remained under Muslim control, despite repeated Byzantine efforts to reclaim the island. Raids from Sicily and North Africa along the southern Italian coasts further exacerbated the region's disorder and instability. Large numbers of Norman adventurers from northern France had made their way into these regions. Among them were numerous soldiers of fortune who decided to remain and offer their services to the Lombard princes. Normandy, with its densely populated lands, left little room for ambitious younger sons or knights without estates. This hunger for land and opportunity soon drove them not only to conquer England, but also to cast their gaze eastward, enticed by the wealth of the Mediterranean. Southern Italy, rife with turmoil, appeared to them as the gateway to such a realm. In 1040, 6 sons of a minor Norman knight, Tancred de Hauteville, captured the hill town of Melfi in Apulia and established a principality there. The Byzantine authorities in the region did not initially take them seriously. However, the Western Emperor, Henry III, and the German Pope he had appointed, who resented the influence of the Patriarch of Constantinople in Italy, both extended their support to the Normans. Within a mere 12 years, Tancred's sons had secured dominance over the Lombard states. They had forced the Byzantines to retreat to the southern tip of Calabria and a narrow stretch of the Apulian coast. Their forces threatened the western coastal cities, and they launched raids into Campania, reaching the outskirts of Rome. Alarmed by these developments, the Byzantine government recalled the governor of Apulia, Marianus Argyrus, for consultation and sent him back with broader authority to restore order. Militarily, he achieved little. However, his diplomatic efforts bore more fruit. Pope Leo IX, a Lorrainer, also grew increasingly uneasy. The Normans' advances had far exceeded what he and Henry III had anticipated. Although Henry was then engaged in a campaign against Hungary, he dispatched reinforcements to support the Pope. In the summer of 1053, Leo set out with a combined force of Germans and Italians, declaring it a holy war. A contingent of Byzantine troops was expected to join him, but before their arrival, the Normans launched a surprise attack near the small Apulian town of Civitate. Leo's army was decisively defeated, and he himself was taken captive. In order to secure his release, he was forced to abandon his entire strategy. This marked the last major effort to restrain the sons of Tancred. Henry III died in 1056, leaving the throne to his young son, Henry IV. The regency, held by Agnes of Poitou, was preoccupied with affairs in Germany and paid little attention to the south. The papacy chose to adopt a pragmatic approach. In 1059, at the Council of Melfi, Pope Nicholas II formally acknowledged Robert Guiscard as Duke of Apulia and Calabria by the grace of God and St. Peter, and with their help, of Sicily. Rome viewed this title as implying vassalage to the papacy, though Robert did not share that interpretation. This recognition allowed the Normans to complete their conquest with relative ease. The coastal city-states quickly submitted, and by 1060, the Byzantines retained only their stronghold at Bari on the Adriatic coast. Meanwhile, Robert's younger brother, Roger, had begun the gradual but effective campaign to wrest Sicily from Arab control. As long as Bari remained under Byzantine control, it served as a barrier to further Norman expansion eastward. However, the political instability in Italy soon gave rise to religious tensions as well. The arrival of Latin conquerors in southern Italy reignited the issue of the Greek Church's presence in the region and revived the long-standing dispute between Constantinople and Rome regarding ecclesiastical authority. Reform efforts in Rome had strengthened the papacy's resolve to make no concessions on matters of doctrine or jurisdiction. Meanwhile, the patriarchal throne in Constantinople was held by Michael Cerularius, one of the most assertive and ambitious leaders the Greek Church had ever seen. The unfortunate events surrounding the mission of Pope Leo IX's legates to Constantinople in 1054 must be viewed within the broader context of ongoing tensions between the Eastern and Western churches. Their visit ended in mutual excommunications, despite the emperor's efforts to broker a settlement. This effectively prevented any meaningful collaboration between Rome and Constantinople regarding the immediate challenges in Italy. Still, it did not mark the definitive schism that later historians would attribute to it. Although diplomatic ties between the imperial courts were strained, they were not severed. Cerularius's power soon waned. After being rebuffed by Empress Theodora and later removed from office by Emperor Isaac, he died in exile, stripped of influence. Yet in time his legacy endured. Later generations in Byzantium came to regard him as a defender of their ecclesiastical and national autonomy. Even during a period of renewed correspondence and goodwill between the emperor and the pope, his memory was honored. His niece, Empress Eudocia Macrimbolatissa, successfully promoted his canonization. According to contemporary Byzantine chroniclers, the dispute received little attention from the empire's rulers. In their view, the challenges coming from the east far outweighed the troubles in the west. The weakening of the Abbasid Caliphate did not entirely work in Byzantium's favor. As Iraq fell into deeper poverty, global trade routes began to shift. Merchants from the far east no longer brought their goods to the bustling markets of Baghdad. Instead, traders started preferring the Red Sea route, bringing their merchandise to Egypt, from where Italian merchant vessels carried it onward to Europe. As a result, Byzantium no longer stood at the crossroads of east-west commerce. In addition, disorder in the outer regions of the Abbasid Empire led to the decline of the ancient caravan route stretching from China through Turkestan and northern Persia to Armenia and the port city of Trebizond. The alternate northern route, which passed above the Caspian Sea, remained unstable and insecure. For both political and commercial reasons, the Abbasid Caliphate had once served the Mediterranean world well, acting as a buffer against the nomadic tribes of Central Asia. With that protective barrier gone, Central Asia was once again free to erupt into the lands of ancient civilization. Turks have played a notable role in history for centuries. In the 6th century, the Turkish Empire had briefly brought order and cultural development to Asia. Even remote Turkish groups like the Jewish Khazars of the Volga and the Christian historian Uyghurs near China had shown adaptability and an openness to culture. But within Turkestan itself, there had been little progress since the 7th century. Though a few cities sprang up along the trade routes, most of the Turkoman population remained pastoral and semi-nomadic. Their increasing numbers pushed them to seek new territories beyond their homeland. By the 10th century, Turkestan was under the rule of the Persian Samanid dynasty, best remembered for converting many Central Asian Turks to Islam. This religious shift redirected Turkish ambitions towards Southwest Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Samanids were eventually overthrown by Mahmud of Ghazni, the first major Turkish Muslim ruler. In the early 11th century, he built a powerful empire that stretched from Isfahan through Bokhara to Lahore. At the same time, Turkish mercenaries were making their way across the Islamic world, in much the same way that Normans were infiltrating Christian Europe. Turkish military units served the Caliph in Baghdad, as well as various other Muslim leaders. Among Mahmud's subjects was a tribe of Guz Turks from the Aral region known as the Seljuks, named after a semi-legendary ancestor. These Seljuk princes were a band of ambitious rivals, working together to promote their family's influence. But unlike the Normans, who were relatively few in number, the Seljuks could call on vast, roaming Turkoman tribes for reinforcements. After Mahmud's death in 1030, the Seljuks rebelled against the Ghaznavids. By 1040, they had forced their former rulers to retreat to their holdings in India. In 1050, Tughril Bey, the senior Seljuk leader, captured Isfahan and made it the capital of a new realm that encompassed Persia and Khorasan. His brothers and cousins spread out to the north, forming a loose federation that accepted his authority while conducting raids into neighboring lands. In 1055, responding to a request from the Abbasid Caliph Tughril, marched into Baghdad. He arrived as the defender of Sunni Islam and was proclaimed sovereign over both East and West. From that point onward, he wielded supreme temporal power across all the territories that recognized the spiritual authority of the Caliph. Turkish incursions into Armenia had begun as early as the reign of Basil II, during a time when the Seljuks were still under the authority of the Ghaznavids. To defend his empire from these threats, Basil initiated a strategy of gradually annexing Armenian territory. After the Seljuks gained control of Persia, the frequency of their raids increased. Tughril Bey personally led just one such expedition in 1054, during which he laid waste to the region around Lake Van, but failed to capture the fortress at Manzikert. Most raids were led by his relatives, Asin and Ibrahim Ainul. In 1047, they suffered a defeat at the hands of the Byzantines near Erzurum, after which they shifted focus to attacking the empire's Georgian allies. In 1052, Kars was plundered. In 1056 and 1057, Armenian lands were struck again. Melitene fell in 1057, and by 1059, Turkish forces had penetrated deep into imperial territory, reaching as far as Sebastia. Tughril Bey died in 1063, having shown little personal concern for his empire's northwestern frontier. However, his nephew and successor, Alp Arslan, wary of a potential alliance between the Byzantines and the Fatimids, sought to neutralize the Byzantine threat by conquering Armenia before turning his attention to the Fatimids. The raids intensified. In 1064, the ancient Armenian capital of Ani was razed, and the Prince of Kars surrendered his lands to the emperor in exchange for estates in the Taurus Mountains. Many Armenians followed him into imperial territory. From 1065 onward, the strategic fortress city of Edessa came under repeated annual attacks. However, the Turks still lacked proficiency in siege warfare. In 1066, they seized control of the Amanus mountain passes and, the following spring, pillaged Caesarea, the major city of Cappadocia. That winter, Byzantine forces were defeated at both Melitene and Sebastia, losses that effectively handed the Turks control over Armenia. In the subsequent years, they raided extensively into Byzantine territory. Faced with a rapidly deteriorating situation, the imperial government was compelled to act. Constantine X, whose policy of weakening the military had greatly contributed to the crisis, had died in 1067, leaving his young son, Michael VII, under the regency of his mother, Empress Eudocia. In the following year, Eudocia married the army's commander-in-chief, Romanus Diogenes, elevating him to the imperial throne. Romanus was a capable soldier and a committed patriot, but the enormity of the task required extraordinary talent. He recognized that the empire's survival depended on reclaiming Armenia. Yet the Byzantine military no longer resembled the formidable force it had once been. Provincial units were insufficient even for local defense and could not be spared for an imperial campaign. The aristocracy, from whom troops might have been raised, remained aloof and distrustful. The elite cavalry, which had once numbered 60,000 and guarded the Syrian frontier, had been disbanded. The Imperial Guard, composed of elite Anatolian troops, had greatly declined in numbers and effectiveness. The army now consisted largely of foreign mercenaries, Norsemen from the Varangian Guard, Normans and Franks from Western Europe, Slavs from the north, and Turkic warriors from the southern Russian steppes, including Pecheneg, Cumans, and Guz Turks. From this disparate mix, Romanus assembled an army of nearly 100,000 men. Perhaps half were native Byzantines, but few were professional soldiers, and even fewer were properly equipped. Among the mercenaries, the Cumans formed the largest contingent. The elite forces were the heavy cavalry units made up of Franks and Normans, commanded by the Norman Roussel of Balliol. Previous commanders, such as Hervé and Crispin, had been dismissed for outright treason, and the troops insisted on being led by one of their own. The main Byzantine commander under Romanus was Andronicus Ducas, a nephew of the late emperor and a staunch opponent of Romanus. The emperor, wary of his enmity, felt he could not leave him behind in Constantinople. With this large but unreliable force, Romanus embarked on a campaign to reclaim Armenia in the spring of 1071. Just as he was departing the capital, word arrived from Italy. Bari had fallen to the Normans. The chroniclers recount with sorrowful detail the emperor's march eastward along the main Byzantine military highway. His objective was to seize and fortify the Armenian strongholds before the Turkish forces could advance from the south. At the time, Alp Arslan was in Syria, near Aleppo, when news reached him of the Byzantine movement. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he rushed north to confront the emperor. Romanus entered Armenia by the southern branch of the upper Euphrates. Near the city of Manzikert, he divided his army. He proceeded to Manzikert himself, while dispatching the Frankish and Cuman contingents to capture the fortress of Aklat, located on the shores of Lake Van. Soon after reaching Manzikert, he learned that Alp Arslan was approaching. In response, he turned southwest in an effort to reunite his forces before the Turks could arrive. However, in a critical error, he failed to observe a fundamental rule of Byzantine military strategy. He did not send out scouts. On Friday, August 19th, while Romanus was camped in a valley along the road to Aklat awaiting the return of his mercenaries, Alp Arslan launched a surprise attack. The mercenaries never came to his aid. The Cumans, who shared ethnic ties with the Turks and were dissatisfied over unpaid wages, had defected the night before to join Alp Arslan. Meanwhile, Roussel and his Franks chose to abstain from the battle altogether. The outcome was quickly determined. Romanus fought with courage, But Andronicus Ducas withdrew the reserve troops under his command and began a retreat westward, abandoning the emperor. By nightfall, the Byzantine army was annihilated, and Romanus was wounded and taken prisoner.